The Darkness of Divine Persecution, Individuation and Psychopathology, a seminar by Robert Moore, presented by the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago on July 16, 1991. This is CD number 1.
I'd like to begin by doing what I'm sure Murray did yesterday and others will be doing, and that is just saying welcome to you from the Board of Directors of the C.G. Jung Institute and the staff and the analysts in the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. We appreciate your participation in these courses and ongoing events sponsored by the Institute. We appreciate your membership, if you are members, because we have been working together with the members and the staff and the board and the analysts to try to make the Chicago Institute one of the leading institutes teaching Jung's thought in the world. We feel very good about the progress we've made, but your participation is very important in that, and we want you to know that we know how indebted we are to you and your continued interest. We believe that Jung's thought is extremely important and that the continued development of it is important, not just because it's one of the major psychoanalytic theories, but because it is one of the few resources in the world today which offers a powerful perspective on trying to see the human species as one. If you look around the world and among the competing theories of the human, you will notice that, unfortunately, Jung's approach to interpretation of culture, personality, and religion does not have many competitors when it comes to providing an integrated view of the human, which is large enough to contain, at least make some space for the human soul and the human spirit, and which takes human sciences in general seriously without becoming reductionistic and turning human beings into machines. Many of us are Jungian precisely because we feel that this perspective on psychology and the human culture, the prospects of a viable planetary culture, because we feel that Jung's psychology is a major contribution to that. Now let me just say, I know many of you from past classes you've taken and opportunities to get to know you. Some of you I don't. Let me just say, give you a brief sketch on my background and my interest in this, what brings me here. In addition to my psychoanalytic practice, I'm also professor of psychology and religion at the Chicago Theological Seminary. I've been there since 1977. As you may know, Chicago Theological Seminary is the oldest institution of higher education in Chicago, and it is the place where Anton Boysen, many years ago, really got the dialogue between religion and psychiatry started. And so that tradition is still alive. We have what is known as the Center for Theology, Ethics, and the Human Sciences, which is a doctoral level work where I teach. I'm a senior fellow there. And we work with students from all the major human sciences on trying to look at anthropology, sociology, psychology, psychotherapy, in an interdisciplinary context, looking at the philosophical, theological, and ethical implications of their perspectives. So I do a lot of shoveling in this area, and I really enjoy it. And so teaching and talking about these topics are something that I really enjoy, and I think we'll have an enjoyable day together, getting into this stuff, getting our fingers down into this rich thicket of reality in this area, because it's incredibly rich and incredibly complicated, and we'll get started today. Happily, most of you are here for more than 1 day or 2 days, and you'll have an opportunity to get even deeper into all this as the week progresses, and some of you will even be here the following week. So without any further ado, let me just say what I would like to propose that we do today, and context it a little bit. I've been working in this, as I said, for a long time. I've been teaching comparative psychotherapeutic theory and comparative psychopathological theories at the doctoral level for many years now. And so I'm aware of the enormous amount of issues that we've got to touch on. And so we're going to jump into this in a minute. I will be able to be back with some of you Friday looking at masculine images of the divine, so we'll be able to continue our conversations. And next week I'll be talking about these issues in relationship to creation mythology and the nature of the human self. So I hope you will see what you're doing today as a part of an organic fabric that will continue both with other teachers and with myself later this week and next week. Now here's what I propose that we do today, and then we can raise questions with me. In fact, I would prefer it if you'd feel free to raise your hand and inject things or raise questions as we go. It'll be more enjoyable for all of us if we'll have some give and take during this. But I propose that we start out by just the topic for today is, that there's that flourish, the darkness of divine persecution, and then individuation and psychopathology. It's going to take us until this afternoon before we're going to figure out what that flourish of the divine persecution is about. You may think psychopathology is divine persecution, or you may not. And until we get to this afternoon, we're not going to have a sense for why some people thinking out of Jung have thought that it was. And why one would even think that way at all. Why would even raise that question? But we'll get to that this afternoon. If I forget to get back to it, you get me back to it. But anyway, individuation and psychopathology. So we want to put, what we've taken as our assignment is putting the issue of what goes wrong with people in the context of Jung's ideas of the individuation process, and trying to get a larger picture about what is happening to people when they get to manifesting symptoms of psychopathology. And I thought we'd start off by just having me share with you just a few thoughts about how to think about psychopathology. In fact, how to think about everybody's theories about it, because everybody's got a theory about this. There's no such thing as the psychology of psychopathology. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is what people have to use for third-party payment and so forth, is developed by a committee that doesn't agree with each other. And so all those diagnostic categories, they look like everybody, that this is science, but actually it's a committee decision by a bunch of people that don't agree. And it's a political act. And that's one of the things we need to know. Everything is political. There's nothing in psychology and psychotherapy that is not political. So let's have that on the table at the outset. So people talk about psychopathology as political at the outset. I mean, we have to be clear about that. So I want us to talk about issues of thinking. Yes?
What is political?
It means that there's always somebody's grinding an axe with regard to a particular way of looking at psychopathology. There's no immaculately conceived theory of psychopathology that we can point you to that will be the truth. So you got to always ask when somebody's telling you about some patient, or if you find out what you got diagnosed as, you got to always ask yourself, well, what axe was that person grinding that decided to call me that? In fact, the more we learn about psychotherapy and countertransference issues, the more we realize that diagnosis of patients has a lot to do with the sickness of the therapist. And so, in fact, we're learning much more about that now. So anyway, we need to talk a few minutes about that. I just need to give you some little pegs. Anytime anybody's talking to you about psychopathology, whether they're Jungians or not, you need to ask a few little questions. We'll get to that. Then I want to context Jungian thought, because unlike some folks, I don't view Jungian psychology as a religion, a cult. That is to say, we are psychoanalysts, in my view, practicing in the context of a interdisciplinary group of people who come from different perspectives, and we have some responsibility to context what we're doing in that. In other words, let me just lay out my assumptions. I do not view the collected works of Carl Jung as a black Bible. And there is no such thing that can be imposed as Jungian orthodoxy, because Jung's psychology is not a religion, in my view. Now, some people disagree with that and treat it differently. But I'm just letting you know where I'm coming from, putting my cards out. So in other words, we are in my view, a scientific psychology. Now, granted, with enormous implications for cultural interpretation, interpretation of myth, interpretation of religion, understanding spirituality, also politics, social change, all sorts of implications for everything. But in my view, Jungian psychology is a scientific psychology. Far more scientific than most people realize. So we need to context it with other kinds of points of views. And then this morning, after the break, I will spend the time after the break focusing on the key issues in Jung's thought that makes Jung so different from most other theories about psychopathology. And we will get to the fundamental issue of why we will have all the plumbing, we will understand all the plumbing we need to understand before lunch to understand why that the darkness of divine persecution title. Then we'll take our lunch break. You'll have time to get over the way I've confused you, relate to food as a self-object, and get more centered and calmed. And then you'll be very clear, and you'll come back, and then we will get in. I will then share with you the broadest outlines of a way in which, the way in which my work in Jung's tradition has, building on Jung's understanding, begun to, I think, flesh out some of the different ways we can think about the ways human beings get crazy and understand it from a Jungian point of view. I'll offer you some of my current work on that that I'm currently right in the middle of. But and then I will also point you to other resources. A lot of my thought already exists in tape forms, the tapes of lecture tapes, and a series of books that are coming out, which I will talk about in the context of this later. But so this is the way I propose that we proceed. Any questions about this, or comments or druthers? Are there things that you would like me to touch on that I have not mentioned? Yeah. Yes, I can do that some this afternoon, and I will be doing that more Friday. But I'll be most happy to talk about how this relates to the challenge of our situation today in terms of human spirituality. Remember, I'm going to be speaking today as a psychoanalyst and a psychoanalytic theoretician, but I'm most happy to engage that issue. So you get us into that by mid-afternoon anyway. Any other things that you, particularly pet things you like to think about that you want us to talk about, some issues? Your diagnosis? Yours and mine, we can compare, we can share diagnoses, compare notes on how far we've gotten on individuation toward wholeness. Okay, well, you'll think of things as we go. Let me just jump into that so that before the break I'll be through all the pre-Jungian or non-Jungian stuff. Now, let's just do a little bit of the kind of thing that I would do with you if you were one of my advanced doctoral students in this seminar on theology, ethics, and the human sciences. And that is, what we do with people working on that is we try to get people out of the idea that human sciences are objective, because they're not. There are no objective human sciences. And so what we always raise at the outset, and we teach, no matter whether they're advanced students in anthropology or advanced students in sociology or advanced students in political science or whatever, we say to them, every view of the human, you know, in Europe back in the days that were totally dominated by patriarchal theory, we call that philosophical anthropology. Philosophical anthropology, that is, the philosophical assumptions of views about man. Well, at least we've got now, we say images of the human. So when you're dealing with any images of the human in any human science, psychology and psychoanalysis included, those systems of thought always have either an explicit or an implicit set of answers to these questions. What is possible for the human? You know, what is this organism about? And what can it do? What is it capable of? What are the built-in what is the built-in plumbing of this thing? And so there's a sort of what we would call in psychoanalysis a meta-psychology in it. But, you know, at the advanced level you would say, well, there's a meta-theoretical perspective in this human science. It's a point of view that has all kinds of assumptions in it. And if you know somebody's assumptions about the human, you can just about predict, without knowing, you can just about predict what they're going to say about a bunch of other issues. If you know what they're assuming, you can just about know what they're going to conclude. And that's what advanced study, that's your doctoral program in a nutshell. Because you'll be ready for your PhD in this kind of field when you get to the point that you can read a little bit of somebody's text and you can say, okay, they assume this, they assume this, they assume this. This leads them to ignore that. And when you ask the question, what is possible for humans, they conclude this, and they put emphasis on the environment rather than biology, or they put emphasis on biology rather than the environment, or they have this mix of biology versus environment. They have this view of the imagination, and because they have this view of the imagination, they will have this view of dreams. See? They have this view about the way the imagination relates to the body. And you can take any theoretician, and once you practice a little bit, once you can do it with two, I like to say two, you ought to know two real well, but once you can do about two sophisticated theoreticians, sort of like, what do they used to call that in English classes where you're diagramming the sentences? I think that's what, if you diagram these theorists, once you can do it with two, you can do it with all of them. So this is the context for thinking about comparative views of psychopathology. You just got to tune up and understand that no two people are going to mean the same thing by these words. And certainly no two schools of psychoanalysis or psychology. So they will have a view of what's possible. They will say, what is wrong when it goes wrong? They will have a theory of how that happens. And then, of course, you have every time you've got assumptions about healing and psychotherapy that go with your understanding of what is and what's wrong. In other words, every school of thought, and when you become a mature theoretician, or if you are already a mature theoretician, you've got a point of view about therapy that goes with your point of view about psychopathology and goes with your assumptions about the human. You follow that? Anybody doesn't get that? Now, there are a lot of people who are not mature theoreticians, and they hold major posts in our mental health system. In fact, I would suggest that most of the people with enormous power in the mental health system in this country have not had the kind of education they need to understand the value and theoretical implications of their own theories and how it relates to what the decisions they make about people's lives. The legislatures run it. See? Or don't run it if you're in Illinois. We'll get into that down on my pet soapbox. Okay, so there is the kind of framework we want to establish to think, because we need to be able to see how unique Jung is. And you can't see that until you see how it stands with regard to others. So let me run through a few of these views. Some of you have heard me do this ad nauseum and you're sick of this. You can go for a walk or something while I do this. Let's start out now. Dominant views in the contemporary world of American mental health establishments. Biological models. American psychiatry is increasingly dominated by reductionistic biological models. And you need to understand this, especially if you get to be a patient. Because I have all these people call me up and they'll say, well, you know, I read your book and it's interesting and everything, but you know, I went to my doctor and he said that I had a chemical problem. That was causing my trouble. Right. Well, there's a theoretical question there. To what extent is all psychopathology a chemical problem? We can talk about that today, yes.
I agree with what you're saying, but part of the problem is another political problem that we don't have time to deal with, and that is the inability of insurance companies to realize there's no such thing as a quick fix.
Absolutely. Totally appropriate comment, and we don't have time to get into the politics and economics of the mental health system, although we should, because it's really the almighty dollar that is dominating the theoretical approach to psychopathology and the mental health across this country. And I would suggest probably in Europe too. And so I'm not a Marxist, but you know, Marx understood some things. And our Marxist social critics, even though they can't run a country, they do understand some things about motivations of people, including supposedly healers. So that's a big factor, and it's very important to understand that if you're a young psychiatrist and your goal is to make X number of dollars a year, And you have a choice between a theory that says you should spend 45 to 50 minutes with a person twice a week, say for $90, $100 an hour, or you can bill them $90 to $100 to $150 an hour for 5 minutes by checking their medication. Now, which will you choose? Well, some young folks are less susceptible to seduction than others. But, I mean, we do need to understand this, and you're right, we don't have time to spend a lot of time with that today. But that's a big issue, and you need to be aware of it, because there are enormous forces which lead us to not be critical of these people that say, you got depression? You got depression? Come to our clinic. We can fix it. We can fix it in a short amount of time. And you'll go away just as good as new, and it won't be a problem. They don't tell you anything about what that does about scrambling your brain. They don't tell you about the way antidepressants ruin your brain in a relatively short period of time. See? Don't bother to tell you these little details, you know. So anyway, that's something to be concerned about, but what you need to know is that this is getting dominant in mainline psychiatry today. Go to the Harvard Medical School, try to talk to them about psychoanalytic psychiatry, well, they'll know very quickly that you're not really very sharp. See? That's the kind of attitude. You're not too sharp. I mean, maybe you'll graduate from the residency, but you're not one of our hot shots. And this is true in the most prestigious medical centers around the country. Now, not in the psychiatric establishment, but in the intellectual establishment of our country, you have sociological reductionists who operate according to a kind of a politically correct point of view that totally de-emphasizes biology. And many of them reduce all psychopathology to social inequity. Now, there is absolutely no doubt, just as we'll see in a little bit, just as it's quite clear that psychopathology, you're an embodied person, and anything that happens to you emotionally has a physiological correlate and has a biochemical expression. So the biochemically oriented people need to be honored for their contribution, and if they can find ways to help restabilize a psychotic personality and lower the side effects and so forth, more power to them. And by the same token, if you either live among, work with, or talk to people who work with economically deprived populations, you will be staggered by the impact of social deprivation on people's capacity to function at any kind of an integrated, individuated level. And you will be amazed at people's capacity to function as well as they do under the conditions they function under. I mean, again, one of the things you can think about is even the way gender issues operate here. Socioeconomic class differences have enormous impact on how much violence is done to children, and to women, etc., and to men. There is very little doubt whatsoever that sociological factors lie behind the higher rates of really severe acting out and severe psychopathology in some minority groups. So, I mean, you got to look at that sociological factor, and with that we want to include the cultural. And one of the things you ought to be doing during your studies this week, and probably many of you have already done this, is to think, what religious background did I come out of? How was it tied to an ethnic group and a cultural background? Was I Ukrainian? Was I Jewish? Was I, some of us here are Southern folk? How did that gospel music stuff that we were involved with affect our mind? Because it does. And so there's a whole, not just sociological in a narrow sense, not just class stuff in a narrow sense, but if you came out of a Polish Catholic family, there are distinct, subtle, significant impacts on the way you're self formed because of being Polish Catholic. Or if you're a WASP Presbyterian, same thing. And what we'll see as we go is that the fault lines, the weak points, the places where you're really susceptible to stress and to fragmentation will be different. And you will tend to get crazy in different ways depending on your cultural background. See, if you held your body, all the biochemical stuff constant, and change the cultures, you get differences in psychopathology. And one of the interesting things, the potential contribution of Jungian thought today, and what's going on, is Jung's Jungian perspective's capacity to analyze mythic patterns, the differences in mythic patterns and the psychological implications of different mythic patterns. One of the things you're working on this week is the implications of patriarchal religion for the formation of psychopathology. It's one of the things we'll be talking about this week. For pathology in females, but what's not very often talked about, for pathology in males. How do patriarchal mythic structures lead to psychopathology in males? So that's an important aspect. Now you want to comment or raise a question or add something before I go on to running through these earlier psychoanalytic theories? Anybody want to say? Yeah.
Maybe I should know this, but could you just define briefly psychopathology?
Yes. It's simply, that's the catchphrase that we use to try to talk in a scientifically respectable way about why people are so unhappy and dysfunctional. So in other words, we've got words like dysphoric. What does that really mean? Somebody give us an ordinary language translation. Dysphoric. Anybody? Huh? Means you feel bad. You know? Don't feel good. Well, the patient came in today and he was dysphoric. See? So psychopathology is our way that we use to talk in this psychological way with a kind of a bringing it into our sphere, talking about what's wrong. People feel bad. People don't function well. People act crazy, you know? Yeah.
You need to find out someone that treats it, find a theory to work with that.
Right, and practically everybody's got a theory. Depending on your cultural background, every cultural background has kind of got a theory. Who you blame, you know? It's usually, if you're a Southerner, you blame so-and-so. If you're a Northeasterner, you blame. But you've got something to blame, and that's your kind of rudimentary understanding of psychopathology. Well, why is this person so crazy? Well, they watch too many soap operas. She sits and watches soap operas all day. That's what's wrong. There are actually people that say that. I mean, or so-and-so is just like their grandfather. They explain it, a lot of people explain it through family systems and so forth. And today we have family therapy, which is a sophisticated version of that. Well, you're this way because of that, uncle. So in any case, we've all got these understandings of this. And what we try to do when we study psychopathology, actually, basically, I like to call this, is you're trying to tune up your magician function so that you can think a little bit more systematically and a little bit more comparatively and a little bit more sophisticated way about why you don't feel good. That way, when you don't feel good, you can understand why you don't feel good. That often doesn't help you feel better, but you can say, gee, I really feel bad today. Well, now, why do I feel bad today? Well, it's probably because of my self-object milieu and self-object ambiance, I was experiencing a little turbulence. And the interesting thing is, though, and here, see, I jest, but the interesting thing is that if you can diagnose it, that's what they used to call naming the demons, If you can name the demon, you actually probably will feel a little bit better. Because suffering like a human that's got some idea about which alligator spirit has got me today, it kind of helps contain the anxiety in a way that if you don't know which alligator spirit has got you. I'm serious. And if you study the cultural interpretations of psychotherapy, take Jerome Frank's book, Persuasion and Healing, he emphasizes the importance of this having something to call it. And there's another book, somebody help me with a title, I'll try to think of it later, but anyway, he calls it the Rumpelstiltskin principle. If you can think of his name, it helps. So there's a sense in which it is a little bit therapeutic. Not much, but a little bit. Right, especially your spouse, right? You know, your spouse studies up and say, aha! I found it. This is what you are. The really horrible thing about that is they're right. You know, that's when it's really bad, when they're really right. That's when we have a rage, narcissistic rage, you know, when they're correct. Because we can feel superior if we know they're wrong. Okay, let me talk a little bit about Freudian and Adlerian views, and again, I like to think about psychoanalysis in general a lot like I think about Hinduism or about Christianity. It's like, a lot of the scholars speak of Hinduism. They say there's not, you know, you can talk about Hinduism, but it's sort of like, it's a great river. And it meanders down through the rainforest and everything, and once in a while a tributary will go off this way through the woods. And 150 miles down it will come back. And this one will go out through this swamp. And so when you're speaking of the river, you have to understand what you're saying. You're not saying it's always in the main channel. See? And what was the main channel, 200 miles down won't be the main channel. It'll be a little swampy creek, we call it, some places. So anyway, you think about psychoanalysis, there's a sense if you have a large enough satellite picture, you can see that it is a river. But when you're down lower, it's kind of hard to see the similarities. Well, I think psychoanalysis is that way. In other words, if you study comparative psychoanalysis in the past and today, you will see there are a lot of similar things. And of course, the great genius that we're all enormously indebted to was Sigmund Freud. And none of us really have enough time to spend enough time carefully appreciating his work and the genius that he brought to it. Let me just say a word about the way classical Freudians tend to think about psychopathology. They have what we call a conflict model. And they are biological in a certain way. That is, they tend to reduce human psychopathology to a problem with your biological instinctual drives. Well, what are these drives? Well, these drives are grounded in what Freud called the id, translated it, instinctual, teleological sort of desires for expression. You can think about it as desire. They call the sophisticated psychoanalysts in the Freudian tradition talk about desire a lot, because the instincts have objects. And so if you've studied a lot of psychoanalytic theory today, you've heard of object relations theory. Well, the word object you have to see in the context of this early Freudian model, which has to do with the way instincts seek objects for discharge. I got this thing, it's an itch, it needs to be scratched. It's built into the hardwiring, into the biology. There are, however, there's not just one, there is a conflict between eros and thanatos, between love and aggression. And not only is there a conflict between love and aggression that has to be overcome, there is a conflict between the antisocial implications of your instinctual drives and what the culture and the society is going to let you get away with. So it's not only is there a conflict between instincts in low levels of development, there's a conflict about how you're going to get those instincts, how you're going to get your itches scratched without getting killed or put in jail. See, a lot of people today, if you were a Freudian and you were looking at our society, you would say that they're not handling the conflict situation too well. And what does the society do about this? Well, not much. Certainly doesn't try to fund mental health programs. But anyway, so you got this conflict model. What is psychopathology? It is the result of conflicts in the psyche, and between the psyche, between the instinctual given and the society or the culture that have not been adequately regulated. So then we get to this concept, what is the ego for a Freudian point of view? Well, The ego is a psychological mechanism which hopefully develops to have you regulate these conflicts well enough that you can get your itches scratched without being put in jail or shot or something. And you know, almost all of classical psychoanalytic theory has variations on that theme. So if you go to a Freudian and you start talking about your problems, a classical Freudian now, not one of these Chicago self-psychology types, which I'll get to in a little bit, they will be looking at you and they'll be thinking, well, now, how is this person handling their conflicts? And how much ego capacities has this person been able to develop? And they'll look at you and they'll think about this and they'll come to some decisions about how have you been able to get to where you feel the capacity to gratify your erotic instincts without undue guilt. Or how are you handling your instinctual desire to eat the world or drink it, see, or snort it? And then they will think about how well you're doing on regulating the conflict. If you're regulating your conflicts well enough, and if you're able to get your instinctual gratifications well enough, you're doing pretty good. And we say, well, this person has moved, Freud would say it this way, he'd say, this person has moved from being neurotically unhappy to just ordinarily unhappy. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
How does that, you know, in Jungian terms, we speak about maintaining the tension of the opposites.
Yeah.
Does that relate to that?
Do you see what Mike is suggesting? He's saying that now, you think Jung talks about the regulation of the tension of the opposites. It sounds a little bit like that, doesn't it? Well, there is a way you can see a relationship there. And this afternoon, I'll try to diagram, we'll talk a little bit about how that might be the case, how you could think about where Freud would fit in thinking about things from a Jungian point of view.
Yeah, he's kind of talking about satisfying that sort of energy.
Yep.
In Jungian terms, it's like, let's hold off and see what happens.
Well, you know, people overdraw the distinction between Jung and Freud on a lot of these things, because we got to remember, Jung was a Freudian psychoanalyst, one of the leading ones, and often would say, why haven't I? People say, well, why haven't you written more about the shadow? And Jung would say, why do I need to write about the shadow? Freud and Adler did the psychology of the shadow. Just look at Freud and Adler. So we will see some relationships, and that's a good way to think about it, because, you know, if there really is a world here, and there are patterns that repeat themselves, then you would assume, at least I assume, that intelligent people from different theoretical perspectives tend to see similar patterns. And they will have to deal with similar patterns. They may not deal with them to your satisfaction, but they'll probably notice them. And if you ask them, if you're careful in your interrogation of them, there's chances are they will have noticed things that they would not like to admit that they noticed. Okay. So anyway, Freud's dictum. What is being cured? Anybody, his little formula for that, anybody remember that? To love and work. To love and work. Can you love and work? I mean, well enough for you? Then you're doing real well. And by golly, if you really look at that the way a Freudian, a sophisticated Freudian looks at that, that's a lot. Because frankly, being able to love and work is not so easy. And if you can really get out of the way of your passion and get out of the way of your body's erotic desires, so that they can manifest themselves. If you can get out of the way of your capacity for joy, that's love. That's being able to be passionate and loving. But you know, that's hard. Doesn't matter who your therapist is or what theory they operate out of. That's not easy to achieve. And you see anybody that's got the capacity to be passionate with their life, say, hey, All right. Admire them for that. Okay. So what is psychopathology? Well, if you're inhibited in your capacity to love and work. Okay. Now, Alfred Adler, another one of the great three in the beginning. If you haven't read any Adler, you want to get the books by Heinz and Rowena Ansbacher, Ansbacher. They have edited two works, Individual Psychology of Alfred Adler and Superiority and Social Interest, which are great introductions to Adlerian thought. Ansbacher, Ansbacher. Heinz and Rowena. Excellent books, and still the best introductions to Adler's thought, which is far more influential. Everybody ripped off Alfred Adler. A lot of the stuff that's accepted in contemporary psychotherapy today is because of Alfred Adler. I wouldn't know that if I hadn't become an Adlerian analyst before I was a Jungian analyst. So, I mean, that's the only reason I know, because I studied the way in which Adler was ripped off. I mean, by a lot of people. But anyway, Adler's view. Adler is a person that takes the social dimensions a lot more seriously, and he looks at the individual organism in a social field, always thinking about the way an organism, the human organism, moves in its social field. So Adler's work is very timely in a sense because of its if you understand field theory or general systems theory or systems theory of any kind or family systems theory, you can argue even that family systems theory is really Adlerian. And that Adler was the first family systems theorist. And so, say you went to an Adlerian therapist and they were going to try to figure out what's wrong with you, right? Well, you got to ask the question, well, what's possible for a healthy person in Adler's psychology? Well, a healthy person in Adler's psychology can cooperate with other people, is not unduly discouraged, and is capable of focusing on the social interest, the common good. Now, think about this in the light of recent theories of narcissism. You can see Adler's approach is also not only a precursor of family systems theory, but it's a precursor of Kohut in contemporary psychoanalytic self-psychology. I always enjoyed Kohut trying to backpedal when people said, "This is Alfred Adler." No, it's not Adler. Of course, he didn't spell out how it was different from Adler too much, but a lot of Kohut's work, now Kohut is a genius, I don't doubt that whatsoever, and we'll talk a little bit about him in a minute, but this emphasis on not, if you're too private and you're too manipulative for your egoistic, narcissistic ends, that means you're crazy. And to the extent that you get better, you will be less deviously manipulative, you will be more cooperative, and you will be able to cooperate with other people because you have a shared task that you agree on. Now, gosh, if you think about the world from an Adlerian point of view, we got problems, right? We can't even agree that we need to not poison all our drinking water, right? We can't even agree that we shouldn't be poisoning all our breathing air, you know? We can't even agree that we shouldn't cut down all the trees. And so our grade of how we're cooperating in terms of the common social interest and the common task is not too high. Well, an Adlerian looking at that way would be absolutely right. It's the increase in narcissism. And we can think about that this week. Why is that? Why is the narcissism? See, I'm asserting to you that narcissism in the world is getting worse. Why is that the case? And we'll be seeing today, especially this afternoon, and after our break, we'll be seeing what happens when narcissism gets you. And then we'll relate it to the addictions, and we'll relate it to a lot of the other dysfunctions in the world today. But anyway, so Adler will emphasize capacity to see the social interest and cooperate to serve it. They're always thinking about how you move in your social field. Do you have, get this now, this little Hadlerian byword, do you have a hesitating attitude? To the extent that you have a hesitating attitude, you're crazy. But they don't mean anything too bad about it. An Adlerian, they tend to be very hard on you when you're a patient, but not out of malice, because they tend to see you as a gold-bricking just a little bit. You know, yeah, well, you know, so you come in and say, well, I'm very severely depressed today. I just don't think, I had a hard time getting out of bed. I say, well, what was it that you felt like you needed to do? I don't know. Well, now, let's think about it. What really pressing task did you need to work on today? And you know, it's a funny thing, this Adlerians do this, you know. It's amazing. You can always find something. If you feel real bad, and you ask yourself, what did I not do that I should have done today? It's amazing. I don't know if they've ever done any scientific research on that empirically, but you know, it's very interesting. And it's also very interesting in terms of their approach to therapy. It's amazing what happens to your depression if you get on the job. It's amazing what happens to your depression if you start tending to what it was that you were avoiding. It's an amazing thing. All of a sudden, you're not as depressed as you were. See? Why, when you were thinking about it or avoiding thinking about it. See? You follow that? So hesitating attitude. Now, what does that mean? Hesitation in dealing with the task. Get that. That's a big word for them. Life task. Not very technical, is it? It's pretty challenging, though. What are my life tasks that I'm not dealing with? You know. And so, what is a person's psychopathology? When they are discouraged about dealing with their life task and they start being devious and manipulative and trying to get out of it. Get it? Sounds awfully simple. Try it. It's very interesting. They know some stuff, just like the Freudians do. Okay. Now, it's very interesting. They have an idea that ties them, and I'll refer you to some lectures I gave on the great self within, which relates Freudian, Adlerian, and Jungian and Kohutian ideas to this type of thing in a little more detail. But the instinctual id in Freud is grandiose in its wishes. The instinctual id, the desires in Freud are grandiose. They want to eat everything. They want to have sex with everything and everybody, including the ponies and the trees. They work their way through the species, you know. Freud said polymorphous perverse, it's polymorphous erotic. This afternoon, that's what I call the archetypal lover within. It is polymorphous erotic, and it's insatiable when it comes to that, see? So there's a grandiose thing, even in Freud's theory, although he doesn't use the word grandiose so much like Kohut later does. But Adler, what does Adler do on this? Is there any kind of grandiosity in psychopathology for Adler? Adler said, behind every inferiority complex, there is a superiority complex. So if you've got somebody that says, I've got an inferiority complex, an Adlerian will always say, I wonder where the hidden claim to superiority is. So there's a superiority, a grandiosity at the root of psychopathology in a classical Freudian position and an Adlerian position. Now let's get to Jung. I'll say a few things about it just in general, then we'll take our break, and then we'll come back and get more deeply into Jung's point of view on this, okay? Okay. Now you had Murray here with you yesterday talking about basic concepts of Jung, about archetypes, the self. He got into the nature of the ego and the self, I would assume, a little bit yesterday, did he not? Okay, good. And he talked some about numinosity. Great. So you've got the key components. You can't understand Jungian psychology at all without really focusing on numinosity. But you really can't understand a Jungian point of view on psychopathology if you don't. So let me just go over what you had yesterday briefly. Jung's assumption is that there is this thing called the objective psyche. There are these archetypal realities that are in the unconscious, that are not there because your mother spanked you or adored you or whatever. These things are part of your human given, part of the collective unconscious. These are part of what you have as a human being. This is what our species is made up of in terms of our biological given and its spiritual correlates. Now, the ego in Jung always has to be seen in relationship, not just to the environment, not just in relationship to erotic desires, although that's certainly there, not just in relationship to aggressive desires, although that's certainly there, and we'll come back to Mike's point later. But the ego has got to relate to all of these archetypal realities in a way that works in some way, practical, well enough. Now, why is that a problem? Now, based on what you studied already, why is relating to this numinosity a problem? And why would we want to talk about numinosity in the context of psychopathology? Let's just, based on what you've already studied, what would you say? Anybody? Have the courage to be imperfect. Anybody? Why is numinosity a problem for the ego?
For willing suspension of disbelief.
Okay, now say more. She says the willing suspension of disbelief is a part of this. Now, probably. Now, how would you fit that in terms of what's that got to do with numinosity?
Well, it's a powerful experience that the ego does not want to admit to.
Yes. Numinosity is a powerful experience that the ego does not want to admit to. Now, that's a big one. One of the things I want you to remind me this afternoon to talk with you about is defending against numinosity. Defending against, that is, unconscious defenses against, let's keep the Jungian word numinosity, and then I'll bring in the contemporary Freudian self-psychology word grandiosity. Because we had all these defenses against the experience of the direct connection with numinosity or grandiosity that is in us. That's the spooky part, see. If you get a handle on this, then you've got a handle on understanding the roots of psychopathology in Jung. What else might you say about that? Any other thoughts on that? We'll go on with this quite a little bit, and certainly later. Yes. She says that Jung points out the relationship between this and awe and fear. And Jung was aware of Rudolf Otto's book, Das Heilige, the Holy, which was translated into English, get this, some professor translated this, the idea of the holy. You see the difference between Das Heilige and the idea of the holy. It's kind of a University of Chicago Divinity School approach to religious experience. But anyway, to really, your point is very important, because what Jung is saying is what Jung is saying, it doesn't matter what you think about this. It doesn't matter what you believe about this. It doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not. It doesn't matter if you're a spiritual person or not, quote unquote. There is something inside your compound. It's already in the door. And it is big. And it is loaded with energy. And it is so loaded with energy that if you get too close to it, if you start getting close to it, you will have awe. If you get a little bit closer, it's terror. And if it's a little bit closer, it's psychosis. catatonia, too. Yes.
Well, in addition to that, if you get too close to it, ego gets hungry.
That's right.
And then you go, why?
That's psychosis, you see. Absolutely.
So if you use the kitchen knife or the shotgun or whatever the hell you lay your hands on, or your Christ, or whatever.
That's right.
Catatonia is the most blissful thing that the rest of society can hold happens.
Yes. That's right. He's making important points here. He's saying that when you get that close, there are all sorts of possible responses to your desperation. He's saying, if I'm lucky, you get catatonic. If I'm not lucky, fatal attraction. See, the knife may come out, or the gun, or the any number of things. You know, when a person wraps themselves in high explosives and has a little detonator in their hand, and they come into the local McDonald's. This is a psychological image. What we need to understand is this is an image. It's a lot more than an image, but this is an image of the way the person feels about this thing inside. It's high explosive, plastique. And he feels like just one little touch will blow the world to bits. Chaos, see. And lest this sound too academic, you know, for those of you that don't work in mental health centers on the front lines of our society, or in the prisons, this is not something that happens seldom. This is happening wholesale in our society now. Wholesale, not retail. Wholesale. And given current trends, it's likely to happen a lot more. So you're absolutely right. What you've got to get in Jung is that this thing is inside. It is something that has always been with human beings. Now let me go into the implications of that. It means, now why do Jungians, do they just have a sort of a fetish about mythology, or fairy tales? It's like, is the reason Jungians study culture because they just kind of want to impress folks about being educated in culture or something? Maybe. But there could be another reason. That is to say, if you take Jung seriously, if you believe that this thing has always been with humans inside the compound, then if you study their mythology and their religious traditions, you will find accounts of it. And you will find accounts of how they dealt with it. And Jung's belief was, not only will you find accounts, but they won't be all over the place. That is to say, there will be patterns that you will notice in the world's myths and religions about understanding and coping with the thing. Let's take a break.
Please go on to the next CD. The Darkness of Divine Persecution, CD number 2.
On the reading list for you, which I think is helpful in getting a sort of a sense of a classical Jungian point of view on this, is Edward Edinger's book, Ego and Archetype. In fact, of all the people around today who have a lot of really interesting and challenging things to say which are consistent with Jung's position on these issues, Edinger has done a lot of wonderful stuff. I mean, you start with that Ego and Archetype book, but if you check with a bookstore, they'll sell you a lot of Edinger books. And he is really marvelous on getting a sense for this, what I like to call the great self within. And he's got a book on Moby Dick. He's got books on a number of different topics related to this. But if I were you, I would start with the Ego and Archetype book, which really addresses this. Now, this little diagram, if you can't see this diagram, you'll want to look at it for a second. I don't think this is exactly like Edinger's got it, but it gives you the idea of what Edinger's trying to do. If you think about individuation, the movement of individuation that is imaged in a classical Jungian point of view, you think about the beginnings of life where the ego exists the I exists as a potential. It's not been actualized yet. But in the infant, early infant, or maybe prenatal experience, there's a lot of discussion now as to how much I an infant has, or how much the prenatal human organism has. And there are differences on that. A lot, though, the directions in psychoanalytic research on this, and I mean non-Jungian as well, lead in the direction of more sense of I in the infant and prenatal organism. So, but we can say this, Freud had this theory of the infant's experience of an oceanic consciousness, sort of a sense of oneness early, that's broken up by encounter with the world. This is a parallel to that. It's an idea that in the beginning, the sense of unity with the world is nearly total, if not total. And as the organism's journey goes on, hopefully, the I will be able to realize that it is not the all. We could say the I comes to know that I am not God. Or at least, you might say in some traditions, at least if I am God, I am Atman and not Brahman in the Hindu tradition. Or that the God within is the Christ within, but I'm not saying I am everything in the sense of the creator of the universe and the be-all and end-all and so forth. So you can think about all that Christological controversy about the two natures and I and the Father are one and all that stuff along the line of this kind of psychological reflection. And one of the things that we want to talk about a lot more this afternoon is I want us to get kind of more specific about what it feels like to be in different positions with regard to the energies of the archetypal self. This afternoon we want to talk about depression, and we want to talk about manic states, we want to talk about addictions, we want to talk about various personality disorders in relationship to this. But if you just look at this diagram, that individuation, we just have got it projected, turn the life cycle this way. Notice that as the person gets older, they begin to have a sense of a part that's not the whole, the I, and that there comes to be a point where the I feels cut off from the whole. In spiritual traditions, they often refer to that as what? The dark night of the soul. Deus absconditus, or something like that. That is, the absence of God. Now, if you were doing theology about that, say, well, now is God really absent or not? And that's a theological issue. Now, from a psychological position, you don't say, well, is God really absent? You would say, well, what's happening to the experience of the numinous? Clearly, here, the person is not experiencing the presence of the numinous consciously in the I, in the conscious mind. Now, does that mean, and we'll get, as I say, we'll get into this more this afternoon, does that mean that they necessarily are not experiencing it in the unconscious? Absolutely not. See, one of the things that I want you to get a sense for today is that it is when you're feeling the absence of the numinous that you're probably in the greatest danger of being swallowed up by it. The self-psychologist would say it this way. If you don't have a conscious sense of your grandiosity, you're probably in a tremendously desperate fight against its overwhelming you. Does that sound like Adler there? Superiority complex underneath the inferiority complex. And so if you think this way, it makes you have an interesting view of depression. I'll give you your assignment for the lunch hour to think about how you might look at depression if you were thinking that way. See? But anyway, then the key concept for a classical Jungian understanding of the development of the personality toward maturity or toward individuation in a healthy way is this thing that Edinger has called the ego-self-axis. Now that is a handy way of talking about developing a relationship between the I and the archetypal self and the unconscious, which is neither isolated from it and pretending that it doesn't exist, nor possessed by it and burned up with a archaic inflation of some kind. So the ego-self-axis, which Edinger talks about, is a kind of goal. That's what you'd like to achieve. Now, according to what you've learned so far, how would one go about, just for practical purposes, how would one go about trying to form an ego-self-axis if you're thinking Jungian? Practically speaking, what would you try to do? Active imagination and working with dreams are two very important ways. I mean, there are others, and we'll think about that. We'll think about that more as we go. But see, if you're a Jungian, you have a real different approach to dreams than you do if you have those other points of view. If you're a Freudian, you assume that dreams don't reveal anything particularly to you. That if you're dreaming, they're trying to cover your sleep being disturbed by your unconscious wishes. So a dreaming, it will tell you about your conflicts if you look at it. But you wouldn't say, if you were a Freudian, you wouldn't say that the dream is coming from this center within that's trying to lead me toward wholeness. That's not a Freudian assumption. Freudians don't believe you're going to get to wholeness anyway. You're going to balance your conflicts. Yeah.
I just have a question about that.
Yes.
A person that never dreams
Yes.
comes into your presence
Yes.
and then dreams next night.
Yes.
Does that mean something figured out about sort of luminous, or is that a conscious decision? I'm interested to know more about my inner self.
Well, that's a very complicated question. He's asking if a person does not dream or doesn't remember dreaming, and then they come to see an analyst and they the next night have dreams. Does that mean that they made a conscious decision to dream, or what? And that's very complicated and subtle business. And the way you'd want to think about that is the way Robert Johnson in his book Inner Work talks about it. It's like you have to think about context for dreaming and remembering dreams. Jung used to say that the unconscious will turn the face to you that you turn to it. So if you say, I'm not interested in my dreams, probably won't remember them unless you're really tired or in a crisis of some kind, which you'll have nightmares. Jung pointed this out, and it's very important to get this sense that the relationship with the unconscious really needs to be like a personal relationship in the outer world. Even more respectful than perhaps in your other relationships. Before you go to bed, you say to your unconscious, I'm really serious about it this time. Got my little tape recorder, got my little pen light, my pen, and I will write it down. And it's very interesting what people experience now this is related to the development of the ego-self-axis, because you got to think about this as a respectful relationship where there are two parties, not one. In fact, that's the thing that a lot of people have a hard time with about Jungian psychology. That is, that if you really get into this Jungian way of living, you really have to learn about an ongoing relationship with a you that is not I. There is a inner being or beings that cannot be subsumed or collapsed into your I, and that actually your goal is to get to where you have this ongoing relationship. So you're driving down Lakeshore Drive in the traffic, and you're talking to your unconscious or some personification of your unconscious. Say if I'm driving down and I just had a dream in which my anima came to me in a way that she hadn't for a few nights, and so I'm saying, okay, so you said such and such to me last night. I didn't get it. So now I'm seeing you, I'm driving down Lake George, I'm seeing you in my mind's eye, and I'm watching you, I'm looking at you just like you looked in my dream last night, and I'm telling you I didn't get it, and I wanted to get it. I'm not being arrogant here, I'm trying to listen. Would you tell me now what you were talking about last night? And there's some active imagination. You can do it going down Lake Shore Drive. People do it, I mean, there are people in our You know, this active imagination thing, I mean, a lot of people do it by putting the figure in the other seat, in the passenger seat. And driving, they talk to the person in the seat and they listen to what the figure in the other seat says. Now, of course, if you're driving in the other car by and you see this person, but that's the Jungian way of life. I mean, you're forever talking to these personifications. Jung said, always personify the unconscious because you must learn to relate to it as a relationship. And this is what he's talking about. This is the practical stuff of developing this ego-self axis, and no one has spoken more helpfully about that for most of us than Robert Johnson in that Inner Work book. But you see that this is really a challenge, and the interesting thing about it is, Mary was saying to me at the break that if you think about individuation or initiation, that there's a sense in which it's really not a static, linear thing. And there's also, in relationship to this, it's not something that you can just leave alone. I mean, you can't do active imagination this week, and now I'm individuated. I've got my ego-self axis established. You know, that's one of the things I like to poke a little fun at our other schools of thought in psychoanalysis, because they have this fantasy of a cure. You know, a termination after your psychoanalysis is complete. And that's, of course, why so many of them never let you finish. Because they notice that somehow something is still wrong after 15 years or whatever. But if you take a Jungian position seriously, you can't have 10 years of analysis and then all of a sudden you stop interpreting your dreams, and you stop doing active imagination, and you stop doing anything to stay in touch with the archetypal self. That would be disastrous. You follow that? Okay. So it's an ongoing process, and at any time you can get inflated. What is inflation? That's a good image of it right there. Where the archetypal self kind of moves in on your consciousness, and you're looking out through the same eyes, but the eyes that are looking out at me is not the you that you were before that happened. See? Let me give you an example. We'll get more into this afternoon. But when we get really regressed, clinically speaking, one of the things that often happens to us is we will start not being careful. That's why accidents happen so often when people are regressed. Now that's something any clinician will observe. When things not going well in a person's life, not only will they lose their car keys like I do, lose the car, yeah, right. Yeah. That's when I'll take my wife's car, which has just been repaired, body part, you know, and then I will back out into the lamppost. Right? This really makes your day, you know. You know you're going to improve your marital relationship that way. I knew that lamppost was there. Well, you see, the way this thing works is the grandiosity is such when we're inflated. Things move out of our way. Right? What is that lamppost? How arrogant of that lamppost to not move out of my way. That's what's happening when people are drinking and they hit bridge abutments. You know, I mean, the world should conform to my space. My space is now very large. It fills the whole highway. See? I'm not kidding you. You know, there's our people that worked a lot with, what is that formula they talk about? That first when you're drinking you get grandiose. Then you get bellicose. Then you get morose. Then you get comatose. Well, you can put those experiences in the context of various aspects of the archetypal inflation. We'll see this afternoon. When you're really grandiose, you think you're the ruler of the world. The world is your body. You know.
Would that be like identifying with the self?
That's right, identifying with the self. But in a particular, this afternoon we'll talk about the particular ways you can identify with the self. Different configurations that I think exist in the self. So if I'm really super grandiose, I think I'm, you know, the great prince of all the worlds. The Lucifer complex, you see. I should be able to snap my fingers, and the lamppost move. See, in fact, I shouldn't even have to ask. If I have to ask, it's a come down. See? If I get bellicose, that means that I am the great almighty warrior. That's God is warrior. And one of the things you were referring to a while ago about when you get grandiose, when the person gets violent, they become the divine warrior, the divine destroyer. I am Shiva. You know. So we'll think this afternoon together about different manifestations of inflation. See, what I have spent a lot of my last 20 years doing is trying to get a little more specific about inflation so that I can show people the way in which different kinds of inflation are related to different archetypal patterns, all of which are part of this archetypal structure of the self. In other words, I really believe Jung was right. I really believe there are structures in the unconscious that when you lose your I and you become it, you can ask yourself, which one did I become today? So do you follow this general idea of Jung and Edinger? You get a sense that you can be swallowed up. Your I can be swallowed up by the great self. In fact, a lot of people who've had major psychotic episodes, I mean, very devastating psychotic episodes repeatedly, often return to this state in which there's no I anymore. It's all I. And that's when you go on the ward and if they're not really heavily medicated, you're talking to Napoleon or God or Christ or all of the above at one time, yeah.
A place where I'm feeling confused about that in terms of the self is the self. It sounds more to me like what you were describing as a complex, more than self, but the complex fills the self and the ego and the whatever, so that's what's in control.
Yeah, yeah. See, when you're dealing with these concepts of archetype, he's asking about how does this relate to a complex, or how does this relate, what's the relationship between an archetype and a complex, and the archetype, complex, and the self. Well, this is why you've got a lot of different days here to work on this, because this is complicated and subtle business, and again, people don't agree about this. There are different interpretations of this. I like to think of a complex. What is a complex? It's an organization. You know, to me, a complex relates to what the Freudians call an internal object. That is, it's an organization that is discernible. If you observe it, you'll see it. It's like a magnetic pattern of filings. You can see the pattern. It's there. It's a real organization. Now, a lot of Jungian analysts still to this day don't use archetypes specifically very much in their work, in terms of clinical work. They will stay with complexes. They will say, well, at the heart of every complex is an archetype, and then they get off archetypes and go to the complex. See, in other words, they really have, many of them have this is where I'm telling you about what I think as opposed to what many other people think. And you may hear lecturers during these weeks not say much about the clinical application of archetypes. And they may focus more on complex or something like that. What I think is, yes, it's true, every complex does have some archetypal components, and maybe several or a number of them. But I'm a person that believes that when Jean Bolin came along and did her Goddesses in Every Woman and her book Gods in Every Man, she led us to a new level of sophistication in looking at the actual archetypal dimensions of different personality patterns and configurations, so we can really do much more serious talk about, well, what archetype do we have here? Now, she did it with gods and goddesses, and I've taken another step beyond that, because what I don't like about using gods and goddesses is that if you have a developed god or a developed goddess, they often have more than one pattern that they manifest. For example, Jesus. You have Jesus presented as a magician. You have Jesus presented as a warrior. You have Jesus presented as a king. You have Jesus presented as a lover. And so I have turned to looking at configurations that are not gods or goddesses, but which gods or goddesses tend to manifest. And we'll get into that more this afternoon. But you always are working with complexes. And the issue would be with a complex in psychopathology, how autonomous is the complex? Well, what would that mean? It would mean how much contact do I have consciously with this organization in my psyche? How conscious and aware of it am I? For example, if I'm working with a man and he gets into rages, where he tears things up and people up, you would say he has a complex around certain things. And when that's touched, he has a tantrum. So it is important to look at the complex and to get clear about what is this thing? What is it is going on when this gets touched? What is the shape of this thing? Let's see if we can figure out what the shape of it is. Let's see if we can figure out what the conditions are when that happens. Let's see if we can figure out what happens when this thing takes him over, because it takes him over. He doesn't mean to beat them up. It just happens to me. I don't know what came over me. Well, I do. It was the complex. Yeah.
But how does strengthening or developing the ego self
Axis. Okay.
help us help me relate to my
Okay.
beat the hell out of her complex?
Yeah. What you'd want, he said her. See, that's interesting. That's what it is. A lot of the violence is about this type of complex in our society today. Well, you'd want to think about, see, you want to develop this relationship between your I and all of the complexes in the psyche. So whether it's simply one discrete complex that's related to the fact that your father beat you when you were 4, it may be a historically grounded complex related to your personal traumas. But again, the goal is for you to see that thing that you get into, which started when you were abused and leads to your being an abuser now, has an organization. And that when it comes over you and you can't do anything to keep it from coming over you, it's really more like this, see. So there's a sense in which you want to develop a conscious relationship with whatever that trauma was, those memory banks, that organization, that tape, as some people call it, so that then when you start feeling the onset, you start asking yourself, well, now what do I start feeling like when this is about to happen? How do I know? Well, let's see. How do I know? I start feeling hot. My face starts feeling hot. That's what happens right before I club them. So what can I do? Well, I start, instead of just feeling a hot face, I now am more conscious. I say, well, aha, here comes the complex. Now, am I passive in the face of this? If I'm really not very conscious, I'm passive in the face of it. It's just happening to me. But now I'm getting out of control here. So I've been working with you, and you're my psychotherapist, and you and I have agreed. We figured out the trip wires for this thing. We figured out the little signals when the complex is beginning to really get energy and really starting to come in and start moving into my eye, taking it over. And then you and I have agreed that when that happens, I'm going to get up and go to the bathroom. Excuse me for a minute. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to get up, I'm going to go to the bathroom, I'm going to stay in the bathroom until my face cools off. See? And there are 1,000,001 behavioral techniques which you can help people with as the therapist on interfering with that course of development, see? That's behavioral psychotherapy. That's right. You're giving them circuit breakers. Absolutely. In fact, the heart of really hard-nosed, I call it street magic. You know, when you're helping somebody, you're helping them with something that works. And if they're having problems like that, you don't try to cure them today, you know. What you try to do is you have them get a little bit more handle on it each day so that they can derail the typical pattern a little bit. Stay more conscious of it. Get more of a sense of, I can affect my behavior, yes.
It's an ultimate goal in that scenario to detach from that heated face so much that you can send it to the bathroom on its own.
Yeah.
To flush itself down the toilet.
Right.
And go on with what you're doing.
If you want to do it that way, see, it's like you want to really listen to the heated face. It's like you're not depreciating the complex. The complex is there for a reason, and it's very interesting. See, we'll think about this a lot more after lunch. It's like, now, Jung always thought in every one of these symptoms there's some gold. We're going to have a conference on that coming up soon, a little commercial for our conference on gold and the shadow. All these complexes have got gold in them. So you got to say, well, now, what is there in this violence that is gold in there that I haven't adequately mined in a conscious way? I have not really integrated this. What is it? And so what might you say? Let's just heal you today, okay? What is there in your tantrums that might be gold and not something we want to just get rid of? Yeah. Your ability to set some limits. That's right.
Catch it earlier and back off. I don't have to confront so
Yeah.
hard.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. That's a practical rule in therapy. No matter what the school, a practical rule is, you got somebody that has temper tantrums, they are not assertive enough. It's a rule, without exception. Somebody that gets into rages, they're not assertive enough. What I do with those people, I send them to assertiveness training. I send them to martial arts training. So you need to get this under control so you can use it for something constructive. So that's absolutely right. And that is an example of what Jung would mean. See, people assume that Jung, a lot of the people will assume that Jung's idea of shadow means bad. It does not mean bad at all. And so you've gotten that from your previous studies. It means something that is not adequately related to by the I, which has gold in it. I think we need to think a lot, and especially today, this afternoon, we need to talk a lot about the way in which all these symptoms carry gold. And when the individuation process moves on, one of the nice things about a Jungian point of view, as opposed to other points of view, is that there's a sense in which we really have a higher view of the human. We really believe you're capable of more. And we really believe that that is not arrogant of you to think that you're capable of more. And we really don't reduce that to narcissistic pathology, that you want to be more. We think that that is your archetypal potentials that are seeking to embody themselves through you in a way that you can regulate. Follow that? And so we're going to talk about more gold mining, this afternoon, and gold mining and psychopathology. Yeah.
If a person has a rage and cannot relate it to his own father or mother, is it important that he understand where it came from? How do you find it?
Well, that's another interesting thing. It's a good question. She's saying, what if you have a rage and you can't really put a finger on where it came from in terms of your personal history? Well, one of the interesting things that we've learned in recent psychoanalysis is that you may have chronic rages and never have been abused. In fact, you may have chronic rages because nobody ever got you down off of your little Lord Fauntleroy high chair. In other words, the Cohoutians use this phrase, you have not been optimally frustrated. You get that? What does that mean? That means that the nurturing milieu, which had the responsibility for parenting you and help you come to terms with this world, did not do their job. They did not help you realize, yes, you are wonderful, but that lamppost is not going to move for you when you're backing out. And so there's this little part in there that every time reality intrudes, I'm enraged. And so you may fly into rages and have been pampered, see. That's where the Adlerians are also good. They talk about the way pampering makes people crazy. See. Pampering meaning that one is not helped to confront the demands of life in a kind of realistic way. So do you follow that? It's like rages don't necessarily mean that you were ever abused. They may mean that you were not frustrated enough in your golden child self. See? But here again, now remember, if you're taking a Jungian point of view, or even, the Freudians are actually catching up to Jung in some ways on this a little bit. Even the Cohoutian self-psychologists today, as I always sell in their books, because I think they do important work, they don't want you to get rid of your grandiosity either. They don't say the grandiosity is bad. They want you to get to where your grandiose energy, read archetypal energy, fuels your life, gives you vigor, gives you energy, gets you over your depression, gives you legitimate ambitions, opens up your vistas so that you're living your life with vigor and with enthusiasm and with some joy and humor, and so they're getting awfully close to being Jungian. They hate it when you tell them that. Yeah.
For someone who's been pampered,
Yeah.
does the general rule still apply that they're not assertive enough?
Well, it's interesting. He says, I'm repeating these for the tape. He says, if somebody's pampered, does the rule hold that they may have not been assertive enough? Well, it's very interesting, and you could argue that case, because, see, if someone has been pampered, they have not been supported in their own efficacy. Well, they talk about this in psychoanalysis today. Here's the $25 word, efficacy needs. Efficacy, self-object, needs. Translate. The desire to feel that not only do I need to do it, I can do it, and I would enjoy doing it for myself. And you should notice that I did it for myself, and you should look at me with a smile on your face saying, I see that you did it for yourself. Aren't you proud that you did it for yourself? Now, that sounds awfully simple, doesn't it? But do you know if we were to put a percentage on the number of people in our world that have had that experience in their childhood effectively enough times? Most of us have had notice when we did it wrong, but ignoring when we did it right. And in fact, our parents were often so impatient with us that they pampered us, because they would have rather done it themselves rather than been patient enough to show us how to do it. I won't ask you to raise your hands, and I want to ask you, how many of you here did your father spend a lot of time teaching you concretely, patiently, how to do difficult things? The vast majority of you would not be able to say, yes, he did, or she did. So that you can follow that. It's like if you're real grandiose, you're probably right. You probably were not helped to see how effective you can be at doing things for yourself. Yeah.
Well, this archetype is certainly reflected by the church, yet I'm talking about the Protestant church in general, where the church seems to take on individual negatives and seems to be jealous of promoting the other to a higher level of living.
You mean individual positives, right? You're saying that they pick on the individual negatives and don't really encourage the individual positives a lot. Let me phrase this for the tape and then respond to that. He's saying that the churches often tend to emphasize our failures and not to make a whole lot of our successes. I think he's right about that. In fact, one of the big problems with Christianity, I think it's an enormous psychological problem. I think it's a spiritual problem. I think it's a theological problem. And the problem is that we tend to interpret people's legitimate self-esteem as arrogance and pride. And we tend not to realize how hungry people are for just a little bit of recognition. In fact, those of you that work with churches, there's a fine book that recently became available, written by Robert Randall, called Pastor and Parish, The Psychological Core of Ecclesiastical Conflicts. That's a mouthful. But what that book is about how hungry people in churches are for recognition, to have their legitimate needs for recognition honored. What happens when people don't get their legitimate needs for recognition honored? Clues? They sometimes leave the church. The pastor better hope they leave the church. Because if they stay, conflict and acting out. And this is a principle, and not just the Jungians understand this, the Adlerians understand it. What has happening when a kid is misbehaving? They're getting attention. They're going to get it one way or the other. You either give them attention in a constructive, pro-social way, or they're going to get attention in a negative, anti-social way. So what are we going to do? Well, we better see to it that everybody gets as much attention as possible. Now, that's simple, isn't it? But you know what? It's simple. But you know what our society, and I'm not even going to talk about the rest of the world, but our society starves people to death on attention. Think when the last time was that you thought you got adequately recognized in a consistent basis at work, in your relationships, in your love life, so forth. People are hungry. And a lot of the craziness in our world today, in our country, is because we haven't gotten to the step one on understanding there's a calculus to this business. People need attention. What are we going to do to make sure everybody gets as many M&Ms as we can give them? It doesn't cost you anything to say, oh, you look nice today. It doesn't cost me anything to say that. But it's amazing how stingy we are. The Freudians called it what? Anal retentive. I'm not going to give you a compliment today. I just know that if I said, you really made an intelligent comment, that you'd get arrogant about it. See? So this is a big problem, and Christianity has got a big responsibility in that. It's not just Christianity. We've gotten the idea that for people to have self-esteem is somehow unspiritual. There's a great book that's available now by one, and we'll stop with this for our lunch break. We can ask those of you who want to stay around a minute. We can do some question and answer stuff for a moment. But there's an important book by Ernest Wolfe, who is a wonderful contemporary psychoanalytic self-psychologist here in Chicago. He was a colleague of Heinz Kohut, and the book is called Treating the Self, something like clinical aspects of self-psychology. And in that book, he says that it is a lot easier for us to forgive somebody for sexually acting out in very irresponsible ways or violently acting out in very destructive ways. It's much easier for us to forgive them and accept them than it is if they come on a little arrogant. And what Wolf points out is, what is that arrogance? It shows that the person never received enough appreciative recognition and attention. Because if they had, they wouldn't be that raw in their presentation of their shining. See? I think that's an important point, and I think Jung has a lot to say to that. This afternoon we ought to just put all this in an alchemical context. Jungians always loved to talk about alchemy, right? Edgar wrote a great book on alchemy. But what is alchemy anyway? Well, it's all these little stages and everything. Everybody's always getting, well, what stage is this? Is it Rubeo or whatever? I never can get those straight, you know. But what it really is turning lead into gold. You know, that's what it is. And there are all these experts about alchemy. I want to say, well, now, what are you doing about helping people really affirm their gold and not feel ashamed of it? That's a contribution that Jung has really offered us implicitly in all this theory that we haven't fully appropriated yet. So you have a right to those potentials that are in your wiring. And you have a right to shine. Let your archetypal self shine through you and not be eaten up with shame about it. And if you're feeling depressed and depleted and like you're nothing and you haven't really achieved anything and you don't have any potential and your life is ended and you can't figure out, what significance I have, well, you just need to get plugged into your archetypal self a little bit more. Because you get plugged into your archetypal self a little bit more, it'll wake you up. You won't be bored anymore. It may be a little dangerous, but you won't be bored anymore. So go out and have lunch today, be a little dangerous, and what time are we coming back? We want to start at 2 o'clock sharp. Before I break, if you will bear with me on this, some of you, again, I appreciate your patience with me. Those of you that have been in my other courses and so forth and have listened to all these tapes and so forth. But what I would like to do now is to present some of my work that I've done in the last 2 decades, which I think builds on Jung's understanding of the self and psychopathology, and integrates some findings from other schools of psychoanalysis, and goes, I believe, further in what I like to call decoding the structure of the self, because I really believe that there is a structure of the self which is, as Jung thought, discernible. And I believe, and this is what separates me from a lot of my colleagues today at this point, I believe that the structure of the self is much more discernible than many people think. And what I would like to do with you for the next few minutes anyway is to lay out for you an outline of what I believe to be the deep structure of the self. And we'll do several things with this. I won't expect to get, most of this stuff is on the record now, and if you're interested in it, you can, the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover book has a sort of an outline of this as it's expressed in the male psyche. There are a number of other books which will be forthcoming. There's a volume on the King Within, which will be coming out in February, and which will have an appendix section, which will hopefully include the kind of more extensive diagrams than could be put in that introductory survey volume. And then as these other, there are 5 volumes in this series on masculine psychology that are written and in press now. In the next year or so, all of those will be out with William Morrow Press. And there will be extensive documentation and further diagrams and illustrations and so forth. And then I'm working on a number of more technical monographs for a more limited audience. Those are popular books written for the layperson to understand. But I have a number of technical monographs and series of lectures that I'll be giving in the next couple of years, in which I will try to address this more to a technical audience, which I like to call decoding the diamond body, and focusing on laying out the structure of the self. And so what I will do this afternoon in the first part is just sketch that for you, and those of you that have seen me do this before, as I say, bear with me. And then we'll use this as an opportunity to talk about why some people may talk about divine persecution. And we'll try to think about that issue of the different ways in which inflation manifests. Because I believe that we are now enabled to see that inflation doesn't come in general. Inflation comes in very specific ways, and they are different. And they are different according to what sector, as I would put it, in the self is being flooded with energy, with libido. And so I'll lay that out for you. And then we'll have the time after the break to discuss it, to relate it to spirituality, and so forth and so on. And let me just make a few comments to give you a context for what I'm going to do. Those of you that are familiar with the collected works are familiar with the extent to which Jung kept emphasizing the importance of the quaternio. 4 sides, 4-foldness in the psyche. And if you haven't done so recently, take an opportunity while you're studying this week, go to the 20th volume in the collected works to the index, look under quaternio, and look at the entries under that, and look at the entries under double quaternio. Because what I'm going to be talking about is the quaternio and the double quaternio. And I'm going to be telling you what I believe the 4 sides of the psyche are. And I will be suggesting to you that as a stroke of fate, I believe that I have stumbled onto what those 4 functions in the psyche are, and they're not the ones I think that Jung thought they were. And I will lay out some of the reasons for that. When Jung did all this work with the 4-foldness of the psyche, he worked a lot on trying to decode that. He decided, as close as he ever decided that he had come to figuring out what the 4-foldness was about, was the 4 functions: sensation, feeling, thinking, and intuition. I'll show you in a little bit later why I think that 2 quadrants of the deep self contain those 4 functions, and that there are in fact 2 other quadrants that typology does not touch. Now, yes, my colleagues, you may be meeting John Giannini if you haven't. He tells me, no, there's a way you can do this that shows that typology really corresponds to this, and more power to him. I hope he can show me how that works. But right at this point, I don't really think that typology relates to the 4 quarters. I think it relates to 2 quarters, and I'll show you what I think that is. But let me say a little bit about 4-foldness, and then a little bit about 8-foldness, and Jung's interest in that. 8, 4s and 8s. The double quaternio is 8-fold. It is an enormous research project to get into this as Jung did, looking at all these 4s in human mythology and culture. Can you think of any images in human mythology and religion and so forth of 4s, the centrality of 4s? What comes to your mind? 4 archangels? What else?
4 corners of the earth.
4 corners of the earth. Those cardinal points are big in every tradition. Every tradition. And see, people just take that for granted, but it's very interesting. Why are there 4 cardinal points and not 6? Or 7? Or 15? Why is it that everywhere human beings come up with 4 cardinal points? See, people don't, they typically tend to take that for granted, and they don't ask, well, now, why is this? Is this an a priori? Is this just given? Or is this a structure in the human mind? If you will notice people's theories, if you look in practically all sorts of books, they got these little 4-fold quadrants. They don't agree with what they put in the 4s, but they got these 4-fold things. Everybody wants to make things 4. But what are some others that come immediately to your mind? The 4 elements is a big one, and it's also cross-cultural. Very interesting. Yeah. Stay with Christianity a minute. 4 is in Christianity. The 4 evangelists. Yeah, the cross. The 4 gospels. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Absolutely. And so on. Now, what about, can you think of any 4s in Hinduism? You do comparative mythological studies, and you will find the 4 mountains in many, many different traditions. The Navajo talked about the 4 winds that make up the self. And if you want to understand Navajo psychology, you've got to understand the mixture of the 4 winds in your personality. How would we translate wind in that context? That's libido. 4 winds, 4 forms of libido. The 4 temperaments. In Hinduism, the god, the creator god, Brahma, has 4 heads. Any others that you can think of? Yep. Now, if you just go into the index in the collected works and look under quaternio, he just elaborates this and elaborates this and elaborates this and elaborates this cross-culturally. Now, I'll be talking about this when I talk about masculine images of God on Friday. But I'll also be pointing to you to some of the stuff on this when we talk about creation mythology on Monday. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of is working on the structure of ancient cities, the earliest cities. It's not widely known that cities in the ancient world were images of the cosmos. They were microcosms of the macrocosm. And it's intriguing. I mean, it's so fascinating that it is overstimulating to me to study the New Jerusalem as it's discussed in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, compare it to the image of Shambhala from Tibetan Buddhist traditions, and compare it to the images of other mythically imaged cities from other world traditions, including Chinese, Indian, and others. There is a book which is now out of print that I'd love to get back in print somehow. It's by a man by the name of Wheatley, entitled The Pivot of the Four Quarters. It's about the ancient Chinese city. And what you notice when you study these is they're all quadrated, cross-culturally. These images are quadrated. There are 4 gates that enter the city. And the city is designed in such a way that there is a center citadel in the center of the cities. My suggestion is that if you want to find an image of the deep structures of the human self, study ancient cities. Because this was before they had a view of scientific geography. And what we are seeing is almost unadulterated projection of inner structures. So if you were one of the lucky ones that recently got to watch those Tibetan Buddhist monks down at the Field Museum doing their sand painting, you didn't get to see that? Doing their sand painting of Shambhala right there before your eyes. Now, in my view, and I intend to elaborate this in the coming years, in my view, what you're seeing is the Tibetans, Buddhists, drawing you with sand a picture of the deep structures of the self. Now, it's very interesting. You get all these images of the quadration, and you just look at your Bible tonight about the description of the holy city, and find whatever references you can. See, you might be able to look in Campbell or some of these other books and see the images, the drawings of some of these old cities. But see, the scientific question is, okay, so this fourfoldness is a structure in the psyche. What are the 4 quarters? So, yes.
Comes out to the same way, meaning that it gives such elaborate details of how to set up the temple.
Yes, that's the point. I mean, it's like if you get back into, she's raising the question about the directions about the building of the temple. In this book, The Pivot of the Four Quarters, Wheatley talks about ceremonial centers in the pre-modern world. And what you've got to do is to look at Eliade's work to get a feeling for this, because we tend to look at these ancient cities as if they're just sort of modern cities back then. We don't take account of the way the pre-modern person thought mythically. And their geography and geometry was not like ours. Their world was all sacred, in a sense. It was all in myth. And so they were extrapolating these images, the structural images of the world, but the world corresponded not to the actual way, in terms of contemporary natural science, things were. In my view, these are clear projections of inner contents. And this is consistent with Jung's assumptions. And Jung was fascinated with all these types of things. He was not as interested in geography per se as he might have been. And if he had been interested in geography, sacred geography, he would have found that his theories were substantiated by what the contemporary geographers are doing in terms of the geography of the ancient world. Yeah.
The question is that I just finished reading Campbell, so I never got into it before. And several things came to mind. One is that he talked about myths and rites as being very conservative. He could show where they would come down. They did not change a lot.
Yeah.
But the other thing was that he took from either, I think he called it mythogenetic zones or areas where culture would start, and then eventually spread out as a total like diffusion, carrying those myths that may be changed by the environment factors or cultural factors a bit, but still the core was there. So how much of this can be said if he lived in those myths how much of this can be said that this was a cultural diffusion, that these buildings, these kind of architecture came out of these myths, and how much is really in a deep structure? I mean,
Yeah, that's an she's raising the question, what about the diffusion hypothesis? There are a lot of people today that try to do a diffusion explanation for these patterns, but even the most hard-nosed scholars cannot trace the diffusion patterns for all of these things. But that is a meta-theoretical issue. And see, if you talk to most scholars in most of the universities today, they are extremely anti-Jungian in their assumptions. They do not accept a deep-structured psyche. And they do not take seriously hypotheses which include the deep structures of the psyche. It's okay if you're Noam Chomsky and you talk about deep structural linguistics and that there's a pattern for language to emerge. And for a while it was okay if you were Levi Strauss and you talked about structural anthropology. But if your name was Jung and not Levi Strauss or Chomsky, you became unacceptable. And it's very interesting for us to reflect together today in the context of religion and psychology why that might be. And a lot of it has to do with the politically correctness of secularism and antagonism toward any religious perspectives that exist in the American intellectual and European intellectual establishments. But anyway, so that you can take a point of view that none of this structure comes from deep structures in the human psyche. And that, but what you got to see is that's an assumption about the nature of the functioning of the psychic mechanisms. And if you have that assumption, then you will not see any deep structures in the human self. You will assume that there's not, and therefore it could not have come from common structures. If there are no common structures in there, these common patterns could not have emerged from common structures since they don't exist. And that is the attitude of almost all contemporary scholars in the universities. I mean, that's just the way it is. And it's interesting to meditate on why that is. But it's an interesting thing to me that why biological arguments are not more acceptable in universities. Because we don't have any problem accepting that other species have certain patterns of behavior that are biologically wired. That they even perceive things in manners which are biologically wired. It's very interesting to me that it's hard for us that when you get up to a certain level in the intellectual world, it becomes, well, you can speculate, but it's like we don't want for humans to be biologically wired. Then we don't have free choice about building our cities any way we want to, see? I mean, it's like it would be very frightening for humans to come to terms with innate behavioral patterns. This is, Anthony, if you want to get into all the stuff around that, read Anthony Stevens' work on archetypes and the work which he does comparative work with that. But that leaves us a little bit of field. Let me bring us back now. I want to move us into this, what is an argument? It's a hypothesis that I want to offer you. And I want to suggest to you that this is not religion, this is not mythology. What I'm talking about is what I think is scientific psychoanalysis. And I think if one looks at the evidence cross-culturally, interdisciplinarily, from other schools of psychoanalysis, and from research psychologists such as Theodore Milan, you will see that there is enormous data which support such a structural hypothesis. And what we do, if we're talking about scientific psychology, people don't need to buy these things unless it fits the data. If it fits the data, then what you do in terms of these things is heuristically, you say, well, this must be structured this way unless I can show with a lot of data that it is not structured this way. So, so let me just present you this hypothesis. When we're talking about creation myths on Monday, I will talk to you about how I think this is related to problems of the self and self-pathology in human beings. In other words, if you're going to be whole, you're going to have to build your city. You're going to have to build your Shambhala. And you might think you can say you'd have to build your pyramid. Because ancient worlds, one of the things I like to suggest to people to think about is why was it that at a very close period of time about 50 different cultures got into building pyramids, different places. And if, you know, you can take a diffusionist line, but if you have a sense that there's some sort of deep structures, you can say that there was a point in the history of human consciousness when they became aware in projected form of the shape of the self. And that would be my argument. Now let me just draw this for you, and then we'll be talking about implications. But let me say one more thing. Diamond body. You've heard the concept of the diamond body that exists. Is very popular in Buddhism. There are a lot of Buddhist traditions. In fact, there's even a Diamond Sutra. And it talks about the necessity of becoming aware of the diamond body within. If you study Jung's collected works, I didn't bring any these diagrams with me, perhaps later on, and so I'll try to get some copies made for you if you're going to be here. But Jung in Ion presents the octahedral shape as the shape of the self. What we can characterize as two pyramids, base to base. And a number of Jungians, John Layard, Jung, John Layard, James Hall, and others have tried to talk about what the shape of that octahedron, what is that octahedral shape. It's my belief that Jung was right in intuiting and describing the octahedron in the chapter on the phenomenology of the self in Ion. As I say, I don't believe it's the four functions, though. Let me just draw what I think it is, and I'll put what I think to be a masculine pyramid and a female pyramid side by side, and then you will understand that what we are talking about is really two octahedrons. You might even, if you were a Buddhist, you'd say it this way. The diamond body is the imago Dei, the image of God within. You say the archetypal self is a psychological way of talking about what theologians talked about, Christians, the imago Dei, and what Buddhists call the diamond body. All the ways of talking about what Jung meant by the archetypal self. So you're thinking now let's say this is the male self. This is the female self. And you say the top pyramid, we're gonna do the male, female. Tensions. Well, I wouldn't. There's a way you can talk about that, and we can get into that a little bit later this afternoon. If you'll remind me to bring me back, and I'll show you what Christians have associated with Satan and what they've associated with Christ, so forth. These represent what I would call, I want to be up front about it in terms of contemporary thought, biograms. In my view, there are four fundamental biograms, programs in the hardwiring, each with a different function, each with a certain set of purposes, each with a certain set of limitations, each with a certain role in a fully functioning organism's self. In my view, there are two dialectical tensions built into the structure of every human self. This tension and this one. In other words, I think Freud was right. There really is a tension between eros and thanatos, or love and aggression. So if you wanted to plot Freud on here, you'd plot Freud on this axis. In mythic cultures, they talk about individuation as going clockwise. So all these spirals, all these images of mazes, you can't get to full wholeness by going up the side of one of these pyramids. You'll get to a certain point and then you will collapse. And later on this afternoon I'll show you how you get crazy if you try to go up the magician's side without walking around. Or how you get crazy if you try to climb up the warrior side. You don't do anything on the other side. So in other words, the reasons that humans have emphasized spirals and mazes is not accidental. In other words, I believe they knew what they were talking about. They were giving us a proto-scientific psychology. They were telling us, look, this is the way it is, this is the way you have to do it. You have to circumambulate. All the ancients understood about walking around. They understood you could not be one-sided. So the way we do this, now look, I'm going to visualize this in your imagination here now. I'm going to pick up this pyramid, and I'm going to pick up this one, and I'm going to put them together like this for the male self. You follow that? I got the anima down here, right? And I got the male engendered male ego here, right? Okay. Now I'm going to take them, and I'm going to put the female engendered ego here, and I've got the animus, right? Got that? Now you will notice that the planes of each, the king and queen are on the same plane. You'll have to do this in your imagination or draw it. The warriors are on the same plane, the lovers are on the same plane, and the magicians are on the same plane. There are your four couples of Egyptian mythology. Now, we can talk about marital dysfunction. What happens if I go? Or, I'm serious. You can plot relationship problems between men and women by simply taking the pyramids and turning them and asking yourself what happens when the queen interfaces with the warrior. What happens when the magician interfaces with the lover? Not good things. Are you following me now? Okay. Now, I've talked about that in some detail in my lectures called The Four Couples Within. Now, for those of you who are interested in psychoanalysis, let me show you a little bit more about plotting, current psychoanalytic thought on this. The best stuff in contemporary psychoanalytic self-psychology says there are different needs. Now, this is not Freudians. I mean, this is not Jungians. Contemporary self-psychologists, they say, read Wolf's book, you have just so many self-object needs that you have to have gratified and supported for you to become a whole self, full, completely integrated self. They say you have adversarial needs. That is, you've got to be able to stand up against somebody and fight if you need to. You have efficacy needs. You've got to be able to feel that you're competent and able to do something that you try to do. Warrior. They say that you have merger needs. You've got to be able to lower your boundaries and feel like you're into somebody else. See? They say that you have idealizing needs. You've got to be able to look up to someone and think that they are really worthy of your loyalty and your affirmation. Idealization, they call it. They say you've got to be able to have someone who will mirror you. Translate that, bless you. That's also this. The self-psychologists do not put much emphasis on cognition. But there's a whole series of schools of thought in contemporary psychology that do. So all of your cognitive psychologies, thinking. Where would you put Gestalt psychology? What does Gestalt psychotherapy and psychology emphasize? They tend to be very confrontive, and they tend to be into feelings a lot. So you could go on and on and on with this. There's even evidence, Don Browning did this thing in this book called Pluralism and Personality, where he talked about 4 cultures of psychotherapy that he discerned from his objective studies. This guy's he's as anti-Jungian as you can get, really. He says, there's the culture of joy. There's the culture of detachment. There's the culture of care. There's the culture of control. Now, these people are not Jungians. They don't care about archetypes. They don't think they exist. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the functions, what I call the 4 powers. And let me reiterate, the 4 powers, I think, are essentially the same. I think that there are not 2 forms of libido. Contemporary psychoanalysis says there are 2 forms of libido. Object libido and narcissistic libido. I say, right, you're right. There is object libido, that's lover quadrant. There is narcissistic libido, that's king and queen quadrant. There's also aggressive libido. That is, aggression is a separate drive in my view, not to be subsumed under anything else. I agree with Robert White, competence motivation. You study, there's a lot of psychologists that do that. Where would you put a behaviorist? Warrior. Always emphasis on what you do. You tell me what you want to do, I can help you do it. It's always emphasis on doing. behavior therapies. Anyway, you can go on, and I intend to later on. So I think that it's no accident that people think in terms of fourfold things, because I think there are four fundamental programs, biograms. I think they're clearly distinct, and I think that our problem in terms of wholeness, what is individuation? It's trying to get up to the capstone of these pyramids. The Buddhists have a saying, I'll get you a second. The Buddhists have a saying, what is attainment? And they say it is getting to the 1 square inch of the 1 square foot. And I think that capstone of illumination is what they're talking about. In other words, I think the Buddhists know what they're talking about. I think that through their meditation, those Tibetan Buddhists have investigated this territory. And that there's a sense in which they know that there is a structure, that it does have a center point. You know, we talk about center point in Jungian thought, that there is a center point. It is the image of wholeness. And it is, but the thing about the sacred mountains, think about sacred mountains in history, the role of sacred mountains in practically every culture. I was just telling one of the gentlemen here that I've climbed the sacred mountain on Jeju off of South Korea. And once you climb a sacred mountain, you have a much more of an idea about spiritual issues. It nearly killed me climbing that mountain. It was nice and sunny at the bottom, and it was a blizzard at the top. My wife and I almost did not get down alive. Really. But anyway, so it's a process of moving up here, and there's a reason. It's not accidental that mountains are sacred. In my view, psychoanalytically speaking, they represent exactly what your wiring knows. Your instincts know that it's almost, think about a hologram. There is a hologram in your psyche. It knows where it's going. And you don't have to be educated into knowing where there is a blueprint in there. And the funniest thing is, you don't have to be a Jungian today to talk about the blueprint for the self-development. I went to a self-psychology conference with a bunch of these high-powered Freudians, and the most hotshot paper they gave, we have discovered that there's a blueprint in the self that is independent of personal experience, that is the blueprint for the house which your self will be when you develop it. I just sat there and grinned. You know, I thought, Carl Jung, you must be enjoying this. But you know, the sad part was none of them had studied any Jung, and they didn't know that they were becoming Jungian there. See?
That's probably the good part.
That's the good part. If they had known they were becoming Jungian, they wouldn't have discovered it. But, so anyway, now let me quickly take you around. And then let's think about you want to think about the challenge of being male earlier and later in life, and the challenge versus the problem of being female earlier and later in life. They're not quite symmetrical. This is the asymmetrical axis. And there is enormous epidemiological, cross-cultural, psychopathological, epidemiological evidence that fits this. You know, male problems are configured differently in psychopath. If you study the epidemiology of psychopathology, male psychopathology is not the same. It doesn't look the same as female psychopathology. Now, is that simply cultural? There are loads of people that will tell you it's simply cultural. I say that's total commie rot. It's not simply cultural. Our cultures exacerbate our problems. They make it harder to be men, and they make it harder to be women. That is, whole men and whole women. But there is a structural element in here that's in your hardwiring that we need to be aware of, and I'll lay out some of what that is. But let me go through this quickly. Program 1, King program, Queen program, same function. What's the function? Inclusive caring. Centering. When I talk about creation in the self on Monday, I'm going to be talking about the formation of the center. You got high levels of anxiety, your King or Queen program is not functioning well. See? If you've got your axis mundi down here, you're going to be able to be calm in the midst of the storm. You're going to be able to walk on water. The image of Jesus walking on the water is about having the King in the right place, Queen in the right place. See? Inclusive caring. It is the program for a nurturing harmony. It's related to the idea of the Tao in Chinese traditions, or it's related to the idea of heaven, or it's related to the idea of cosmos in Greek traditions. See, we think cosmopolitan. See?
It's a magazine, right? But in the mythical world, the words for world didn't just mean, you know, what you see. What you see may not be world at all. In fact, if I were thinking and speaking mythically, let me do it for a minute. I'm going to speak mythically. I look out here at Chicago and do I see cosmos? Hell no. I see chaos. I see a war between cosmos and chaos, and I see chaos having an upper hand, essentially. Why? Because in cosmos, what's the case? Justice and peace. Cross-culturally, when world is established through a center, you start with a center and you move out. That's, Eliade pointed it out. You always start with the center and move out when you create world. If you can't find the center, you can't have a world. So what do? We send out our goat. We get our shamans, we're all shamans here today. We got our goat. So we turn our goat loose, and we try to be quiet, not bother it. We watch where it goes. And where that goat stops to graze, that's the center. And that's where we will put the stone. And that's the stone that's going to be on top of the turtle, which is on top of the elephant, all the way down. How far down? Turtle's all the way down. It's all the way down there. And then we start, that's the cornerstone of ours, that's the point at which we start the building of our city. Cross-culturally, divination is a search for the center. You don't build anything, temple, city, house, get back to a self. You don't build a self until you find the center. The center's not I, the center is what it is. You follow that now? Okay, now that's the way mythology, I'm just saying that this is true in mythology. The center is that point at which these energies are balanced. Get this now. For purposes of understanding psychopathology and so forth, I didn't say merged. I didn't say we took a stew and made it into a soup. I said these tensions are balanced in a dynamic tension. I like to tell people, think about this like weightlifting, working out on a Nautilus machine. You don't build up your biceps alone. You try to balance the other muscle system that balances that system, right? So when you're thinking about developing your psyche, individuating, it's not a passive process, and unlike the Freudian metaphors of digging up, you know, you're going to dig up the structures of the unconscious, it's more like the old Masonic metaphors. You got a little trowel, some mortar, and some stones, and you start building this thing. Think about all that imagery about rebuilding the temple. Okay, so the king and queen, centeredness, calmness, inclusiveness, holding all of the tensions together. That is to say, from the point of view of this king program, there really shouldn't be anything that's left out. This works fine until you've got another king over the hill, all right? How do you explain the other king over the hill, the other tribe? Well, that must be who?
The devil.
Yeah, and who is the devil? He's the king of the underworld. He's the king of chaos. I'm the king of cosmos, right? That other king can't be the king of cosmos because I'm the king of cosmos. That's Saddam Hussein. I'm Ayatollah Khomeini. I serve Allah. He serves Shaitan. And then over there in Baghdad, we're looking the other way. I am the Lord of Cosmos. He is the Lord of Chaos. So then we have an 8-year war. Kill as many of our people as we can. So forth. There's the problem. Since you have a king and queen in you, and you have a king and queen in you, and we all got kings and queens, if we don't psychologize this stuff and understand that these are inner realities having to do with spiritual and psychological development, and we get it all projected out there, then we have competing totalitarianisms, right? The history of the human species. Once you start encountering other groups, you got a problem. As long as your tribe is isolated, it's not a problem. But as soon as you encounter the other tribe, you're a Yoruba and you run into the Igbo or whatever. Or you're a Zulu and you run into the other tribe. See? You follow that? So in other words, tribalism as a problem is built into the fact that we've all got these kings and queens inside. And if you don't get them inside so that you can cooperate, you got problems. Okay. Warrior energy, focusing, effectiveness, planning, organizing, capacity to set boundaries, the capacity to stand up for your boundaries, the capacity to be loyal to a legitimate person, place, or thing, the capacity to be faithful in relationships. What? Yep. That is the only program, in my view, that has any capacity for faithfulness in it. We'll see why in a minute. Magician. Understanding. Detachment. So that you can be reflective, right? It's the archetype of intuition. This is your inner wise man or wise woman. It is the part that can stand back and understand all the plumbing of all the worlds and all the galaxies. It's your inner physicist. At low levels, it's a trickster. Now you see me, now you don't. At the highest levels, it's the shaman, who integrates a lot of the virtues of the others, and a healer. You understand that lower levels of development, the magician is not a healer. I'm just going to study you. Take your money and I'm going to study you, but I don't give a damn whether you get better or not. Higher levels of development, where it's more of these are integrated in terms of fueling each other, concern for healing. Lover program, sexuality, relatedness, intimacy, dependency. The capacity to be dependent. What? That's bad. No, it's not. Too much talk of codependency can drive you nuts. That is to say, let's watch it about making dependency pathological. Dependency is not at all pathological. The most healthy people narcissistically can accept their dependency in object relationships. In fact, one of the definitions of narcissistic pathology is when you can't admit that you really are dependent. Never will forget when my anima said to me in a dream, what you can't deal with is your dependency. Why would the anima say that to me? Well, in a man, she's the one that comes on when he begins to be a little more aware of this space. What are the spaces? World. Plane of battle, Armageddon. The garden. Transformative space. The alchemical vessel. The temple. So forth.
Please go on to the next CD. The Darkness of Divine Persecution, CD number 3.
So now that is what I think is the structure. Now let me say just a little bit about pathology. Now let me refer you to a person I admire very much, Theodore Millon, M-I-L-L-O-N, whose work on scientific research into psychopathology I think is the best there is. You can start with his 1968 book called Modern Psychopathology, but the one that's easiest to get at, and the one I like to use to teach people with, is his book called Disorders of Personality. It's available, it's kind of expensive, but it's something, you really ought to get you a copy of it because it lays out the personality disorders and shows you the patterns of each. Millon, in his basic approach, says that it's very interesting. Now, this is a person that's not a Jungian, and he can't stand psychoanalytic thought. He calls himself a biosocial evolutionary theorist. And he's not a clinician. He doesn't do psychotherapy. He bases all of his thought on scientific research psychology, empirical research psychology. Get this now. He says there are 4 fundamental forms of psychopathology. Oh, how about that? He says that the four forms of psychopathology are as follows. There are the forms which are based on independence. There are the forms, that's king and queen. There are the forms that are based on detachment. There are the forms that are based on dependency. And there are the forms that he says are based on ambivalence. Ambivalence for the warrior. Explain it to me, somebody.
No.
If you've got too much warrior, what's that got to do with ambivalence?
Well, you have the inability to act in this world.
Yeah.
Can't decide.
But if I got all this warrior energy, what's the problem? If I got all this warrior energy, why am I ambivalent?
Don't know which way to go.
Well, that may be part of it. What else? Ah, see? If you don't have your center clear, you'll be like a young man that said to me recently, I mean, a very assertive, shall we say, aggressive young man. You know, I mean, not the kind you want to pick a fight with. He says to me, well, I'm real good at all this fighting stuff, but I'm lost. See? Don't know where I want to fight to. So you got, that's an important one. That's not, a lot of people don't see that. I think that's an interesting one. But what do we know about, take Erik Erikson's work, what do we know about conflicts between autonomy, shame, and doubt? What do we know about conflicts between initiative and guilt? You would associate autonomy and initiative with this warrior thing. And human beings tend to get scared when they get too assertive. Why? That's accepted. That's not Jungian. That's accepted by practically every clinician around. Why is it that they tend to get scared when they get assertive? Back here. Ah, well, envy, he says. Absolutely, that's right. But let's think about, say, I'm in a relationship with you, and I start doing what I want. Why should I be ambivalent about that? Ah, I might strike you if you refuse to support me doing what I want. And since I care about you, the idea of striking you makes me feel ambivalent. I'd really like to strike her. But after all, she is kind of nice. So I don't want to strike her. She needs striking. But I don't want to strike her. She doesn't need striking. And people struggle with this business a lot. I mean, this is where people live out here in the city. And but there's some of the others you pointed out other important things about this ambivalence thing about the assertiveness. Because you get very assertive, what's going to happen to your relationships? You're going to lose them. Because a relationship will not sustain unlimited individual assertiveness. No relationship will sustain it. That individual assertiveness has to be modulated unless you've got the other person totally in bondage. Some people try that, you know. Yeah, Mike.
Retribution. The two assertive start to stand out too much.
Yeah, that relates to this. Yeah, that's right. See, so look, I mean, Milan just says, I mean, he's just basing this on what happens to people from research. Well, there are all these ambivalent types. Well, he doesn't really get into any kind of unconscious stuff about it, talk about it, but aggression is, we're all ambivalent about our aggression. Even the people that are the best at integrating it, it's not neutral. It has to be regulated. All of those martial arts traditions are about the struggle to get that stuff regulated and under some kind of conscious control, under some sort of loyalty. Yeah?
What about the fear of actually defeating the enemy and then having no enemy?
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, he says, what about the fear of defeating the enemy and then there not being any enemy? That's essentially that point to where that young man is. He says, I went out and I fought the battle and I won. Very successful man. He really is. And now he's depressed. So, and see, now this is what you got to get about this one-sidedness, and this is where we come back to inflation, right? So, if you're inflated in, we're not going to be usually inflated in all of them equally. If you can be, congratulations. You know, it takes some doings to be that balanced in your inflation. Most of us kind of major in being inflated in one or two, maybe. So, what I want you to be thinking about, and we'll share around that, your ideas about what it looks like if you're inflated in each of the quarters, or two. Think about that now. But now, what we're talking about now, you get inflated in this, you don't have much of a sense of king stuff, so you don't have much of a sense of the overarching purpose of your aggression. So you need to be fighting all the time, because if you ever win the war, the peace scares you to death. Think about human history. What are male human beings good at? They love to fight. That's just an empirical observation. They love to fight. They have a revolution. We're going to overthrow these rascals. We're going to get them out. So we have our revolution. We throw out the rascals. Then we're the rascals. We have to take care of the trains and the plumbing and the sewage and getting food and running the institutions, and we become quickly the rascals. We don't have the emotional wherewithal it takes to do the king and queen trip. That's where we are in the world. In contemporary psychoanalysis, they talk about the need for generativity as a virtue. That is a king and queen virtue. No king and queen program actualized in the personality, no generativity. Well, then so what? No generativity, no nurture for the whole surround. Well, isn't the father the same thing as the king? No. Why not? I'm taking care of my family. Is that not the same thing as the king?
The king has to lead.
Yeah, that's right. The king has to lead more widely than the family. See? In other words, you cannot, like some Jungians do, reduce this thing to the father archetype. This is not the father archetype. The mother archetype is not the queen archetype. It's the same kind of energies, but to call the father archetype the central issue here is to miss how large this king thing is for the world, for all the world. The king in you, or the queen in you, cares for everything on the planet. So you say, well, so-and-so does not have a concern about ecology. No king, no queen. Because if they did, they would not be splitting everything into, well, I'll have my family be successful, and we will have a good retirement portfolio. I've got myself circumambulated here. We'll have a good stock portfolio. We don't need to worry about the environment. We're going to retire in Phoenix or something. You know? You follow that? Okay. Now we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to together work with understanding if you get inflated in the king or queen, what does that look like normally? And then we're going to go around, and then before we stop this afternoon, we'll be thinking about, now why would somebody talk about divine persecution in this context? You think about this as an image of God. Okay, let's take about 10 minutes, come back at 15 after. And remember, we didn't get into this. I talk about it some on these other lectures, and we'll try to elaborate more in the future. In this King Warrior Magician Lover book, we talk about the active and passive poles of the shadow side. You think about the shadow as being down here at the base. And each of these programs has got a bipolar shadow. That is, there's a positive, this also, Milan talks about this, there's an active and passive form. So that's the bad news. See, the bad news is that you can be in trouble because you have too much of this flowing through you. You can be in trouble because you have too little of it flowing through you. See? You can be in, say, let's take the king just for an example, and then we'll do this around. If you are just sure you have no king energy at all, you're projecting that somewhere. And so it's not that you don't have it, it's just that you can't let that into your conscious mind. And so you relate to it through somebody else. Codependency, right? Okay, so in other words, you got that's a passive mode, right? Of being in trouble with that with a passive mode. Okay, you have an active mode. Okay, what would somebody be like who was shooting up mainline with king energy, or queen energy for that matter? What would they tend to be like? Compulsively in charge, right? They can't not be in charge. What else? Right, because I mean, if you're the queen, you are what? You are the what? You're responsible for all. But where are you located in the cosmos? You're in the top and the center. Yeah, but feminists told me that female things are always not vertical. How could it be that the queen would be vertical?
They didn't tell me that.
They didn't tell you that. Well, you see, it's things are not vertical for the warrior. They're always horizontal for the warrior. A lot of radical feminists are warriors. Things are not vertical for warriors. They are horizontal. There's a field of battle that's out here, and you got your binoculars. Mrs. Patton here. Yeah. MS Patton, excuse me. Thank you.
The queen is looking down, the warrior is looking out.
See, I'm really serious when I say the attitude towards space is not the same in these things. And it's not so much, the queen is looking down, but have you seen these statues of the Virgin of Guadalupe? You know, Mary, and she has got this wonderful cloak, right? Have you seen that? If you haven't seen it, you ought to try to find one. And what is in the cloak? All the world is in the cloak. You can see different ones. A lot of the time it's body parts. All sorts of body parts. Hearts and legs and noses and arms and fingers. And why? Because what? What? Because she heals them all. What? She brings them all together and blesses them. I mean, if you want to, I have one I got in Mexico, and if you want to have a sense of the queen, you go to Mexico and get a statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Well, that's the queen. Now, let me play with that in a minute. How do we know that the Virgin Mary is a virgin? Archetypally speaking. How do we know she's not into having sex? Is she into having sex? No. Kings and queens don't have genitals. Literally. What do you mean? They are the genitals, cosmic genitals. That is to say, you know, I'm literally true. In mythology, the representation, for example, just look in Indian culture, the representation of the union of the king and queen of the universe is the lingam and the yoni. See? But that doesn't mean coitus. That doesn't mean sexual intercourse at all. That's not what that's about. That's about the creative matrix of world. And so when think about it, when you're into your mothering, or for those of you that have children, for your mothering or your fathering, it's awfully hard to be real turned on erotic when you're changing diapers. RD. When you are in that caring, that nurturing mode, that is not an erotic turn-on. Now, there are erotic dimensions of it to the extent that one is integrated. There is a kind of if one is kind of moving up the pyramid, one can have joy and all of that stuff and really experience joy. So it's not that it's not related, it's just that is not about sexuality. So think what happens to couples that spend all their time in their parenting roles with each other. You know what the family therapists say about that? You start working with a couple, and everything is going crazy in this family. What do? Well, you start working on the man and the woman getting some time just as the male and the female partners, preferably at Sybaris or something like that. So that they remember, oh, this is how I got into this. Oh, we do have those things. You know, they are real, you know. I'm not kidding you. Okay. Now, the big one in our culture is the narcissistic personality disorder. If you are really shooting up with king or queen energy, you tend to think you're the center of the world and you deserve to be adored and have everybody relate to you like you're the center of the world. And that you're on the throne and your decree goes. And usually a person that's like that links up with what other kind of personality disorder? In the form of a dependent personality disorder. The classic dyad is between a narcissistic often male, but not always. Narcissistic male or female, and a dependent male or female. A lot of people, you know, like to say, well, that's mostly the male that's that way. It's really the dependent woman. And I say, well, how much time have you spent around elderly couples lately? And how many kings versus how many queens do you notice in elderly couples?
They tend to change over the years.
Oh, I think it always changes in some ways over the years. But it's interesting, you see. Think about that in terms of life cycle and just extrapolate. Okay. So now, what about somebody who is shooting up with magician energy and mostly that? What are they like? Think about it.
Pretty detached.
Detached, he says. Litmus test. Right there. You can look in their eyes. And there's a person that's into that stuff has a certain flatness in their eyes in terms of interpersonal connection. One of the things clinicians will often do is sit in a room with somebody and they'll say, do you feel like there's anybody else here? And if you're sitting there and it's like you can't feel any kind of something reaching out to make connection with you, then you've got somebody that's in a detached mode, and they may be schizoid or worse. And that's a magician inflation. You follow that? That's one form of the magician inflation. Tell me a couple of other. What other ways, if you really want to get crazy in the magician quadrant, inflated, of course, or maybe the passive form. Let's don't leave out the passive form. Okay, which one did you want? Okay. Passive form. What if you're going to be passively inflated in the magician? What would you be like?
I'm not sure, but how about someone who doesn't even have a sparkle in their eye, like the fire has gone out?
Yep. That certainly. And it would be related to another passive form. Whatever. Think about it now. If you're really in the active form, you what? You know everything, right?
But wait.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're attached and things aren't right, you become disappointed. And I could see then why the sparkle would go from your eye.
Yep.
But if you were detached to start with, you didn't give a damn. And so things aren't so good and they didn't go so well. Shit, I had no expectation.
There are many people, they call them in the DSM-3, you talk about asocial, see. Well, one of them, see, it depends on the family. See, you may have been raised as the lost child in the family. And if you were... Okay. I'm just saying that in families you will have often a lost child, and that will be the child that was trained to be detached. See? They were always expected to be detached. See? Okay, but now there are other ways. Remember, if you really are flooded with this, you're inflated, the typical thing is the know-it-all. This is the person that thinks they know everything, and they always are explaining it always to you in a very vociferous way and angry with you if you don't know that they're right. So that's, yeah. But, you know, the harder thing to see, the Adlerians are good at seeing this, but the harder thing to see is the dummy. I don't know. Why did you ask me? See, you're the smart one. See, Adlerians are great at picking that up. Adlerians don't buy that at all. You know, they see the manipulation in that. You know, you say, well now, why didn't you do this or that? I didn't think of it. I'm helpless, all right? The Adlerian looks at that and they say, pretty good. Got everybody else waiting on you, right? Don't have to think of a thing. And you can let things go to hell. Nobody can blame you because, after all, I'm just a dummy. See? What do you mean, I let your steak burn? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm so stupid. Of course, my steak is all right. But see, it's like you can be inflated. See, it's very interesting. You can be inflated in this magician thing, and of course, but you put it away. You put it on the other person, and they're smart and you're dumb. But it's an inflation. It's Omega's inflation. It's just a kind of a negative form. That's what negative inflation looks like. So you're working on any of these, you know. You don't think about that one as often, but we think that the dummy and the know-it-all really are two ends of the same stick. Yeah.
Isn't a person who is a know-it-all, doesn't that usually, especially for women, they say that's the animus?
They say that's the animus. I think that's sexist. I don't agree with that. That's a traditional way of talking about that. They say a woman, you know, the old classical way would be to say an opinionated woman, which means a woman that thinks something other than you. An opinionated woman, you say that's animus. I don't think that's necessarily masculine at all. I just think that is a magician part that's working and not accepting your interpretation, you see.
They also say that shadow thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, but you know, it's always interesting, political side of all this stuff. You know, you're opinionated. I forthrightly, push my ideas. I am assertive with my ideas. You're opinionated. See. But it's interesting. One aspect of an inflated magician would be somebody that really does not know what they do not know. And so they press in a very vociferous way their stereotyped ideas on something without having looked at it at all. And one form we see about in popular culture now, this, you know, it's the shaman who went on a vision quest and they had an altered state of consciousness, and they've decided now they're a shaman. They understand all the worlds. And they come back with their magician glow on, and they expect everybody to come to them for training and initiation. They often do not see how fragile their self is that's led them to this kind of overconfidence in their spiritual prowess. And these people are all over the country. They declare themselves great Buddhist teachers often, you know, or whatever. And for example, I mean, they can, and often will get a big following. This is your sort of compulsive cult guru thing. And that is if they have any talents. And you think, boy, great enlightened master. And then what the kind of thing happens, you suddenly discover that not only has your Buddhist guru of this community been promiscuous as he could be with the people in the community, he has had AIDS for years and has not told anybody about it. This happened recently in one of the major traditions. Now that strikes me as not a great example of spiritual elevation, not telling your lovers that you have that you're infected with AIDS. But now that is in the New Age community, you see a lot of that kind of inflation, but it's by no means the largest one. All academic faculties are full of magician inflations, and all schools of psychotherapy are full of magician inflation. And typically, we went into this business because our culture and our families in some way socialized us to feel more comfortable in that space. There are all kinds of studies of psychotherapists that tend to be a little bit too detached and voyeuristic. Yeah.
On a more mundane level,
Yeah.
would you characterize Archie Bunker as having
He could, because he was always spouting about every, he knows everything about all the minority groups and everything.
extrapolates?
Yes, right. Yeah, and that ability to exaggerate and overgeneralize. That is a classic. In fact, you can think about what else is a classic magician inflation. All fundamentalisms. All of them. Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. They're all magician inflations because they radically oversimplify and exaggerate. That's their stock in trade. And they do not have what I like to say, in less polite company, their bullshit indicator is not functioning very well. And they're not aware of their own bullshit. They think they see it everywhere else, but not in themselves. That's a classic fundamentalist pattern. And it's very interesting. It's one of the things that's going to lead us down the nuclear holocaust tubes in the future on this planet. Because there are a lot of fundamentalists around the world in different traditions that are working real hard to get the bomb. We've been listening on the news lately, right, about, yes.
In business, there's a parallel. It's the fundamentalist that is selling vision this week. It's the newest pink pill.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not,
Oh, yeah.
it becomes a religion for a company if the CEO decides it's going to be. But it's the same.
Sales is full of this.
Oh,
That's right.
sales
Sales is full of this
It's
kind.
gone, yeah.
That's right.
Sales is in and out of it and in and out
Yep.
of it. But
Mhm.
the thing that is finally being debunked now is Vision College and Vision University and the center of
Oh, yeah.
vision.
Oh,
for
yeah.
One company after another after
Oh, yeah.
another.
Oh, yeah. And you see this, if you just kind of keep up with popular culture, there's always the new seminar, right? And it has everything. Nobody else knew anything. And in fact, this is what happens recently there was this book that came out. Did you see it? I can't think of the name. It's something about the Peter Pan syndrome. Wow, the Peter Pan syndrome. No mention of Jung. No mention of puer aeternus, right? No mention of von Franz's book, Puer Aeternus. But it's presented as new findings. See? Magician inflation.
When you talk
Yes.
about this magician inflation, I hear one thing that seems to come up, and what do you have to say about it? And that seems to be this gross irresponsibility. You talk about this shaman that's going around not only is he disobeying his own teaching,
Yes.
he's doing an incredibly irresponsible way.
Yes.
Now, is he aware that he's doing that? It seems to me he's got to somewhere know that.
Well, there's part, but you see what? Now look. Now think about the shadow now. If this is where most of your conscious energy goes, what's mostly in your shadow? That doesn't mean these are not too, but this, if you're really heavily centered here, that's the useful thing about this, because I really believe you're structurally organized, and if you can figure out where your dominant energies are, you also, it's very much parallel to what they do with typology. This is a parallel to the typology. Say, if you know that this function is high, you can probably assume, well, here, your king, and the king is the one without balance by the other energies, does what he wants without any rules. I am the rules. And so if you have a shadow king in your unconscious, you do what you please. You're not subject to your own rules. You may record all of your conversations, but you don't ever intend for anybody to listen to them. Yes?
I'm thinking of Jonestown and the ultimate malevolence.
Oh, yes.
So that it's not just that, I don't know, it's not just that you're not aware, it's the lens.
Oh, yeah. She's saying that she's thinking of Jonestown and about the horror of how far one will go. We see, if the king is in your unconscious or the queen is in your unconscious, see, you do not know you are a sociopath. Because where is the sociopathic personality chiefly organized? In this. The king and queen stuff is the active independent. Well, does that mean if your conscious ego is not organized in the active independent that you're not a sociopath? Heck no. It just means that you don't think of yourself as a sociopath. In your shadow, you're acting out right and left, doing what you please. See, this is the psychotherapist that sexually abuses their analysan or a client, because I'm just doing this for your own good, helping you work on your intimacy. But the shadow king has no rules. I'm not subject to any rules. No regulations or anything. Yeah.
The specific instance of that Buddhist shaman, I just happened to be reading this morning in a book on the shadow where he was addressing the conference when confronted with what he'd been doing, and he just said, well, I just felt I was beyond all this, and somehow he was immune to the virus or whatever.
That's right.
So even when he was confronted with that.
Oh, yeah. This is a rule. See, the incredible thing about this stuff, and this is not just with this guy. I mean, when one's shadow is dominated by this thing or this thing, you have this enormous sense of entitlement. You're not really, what do you mean breaking rules? I get the words, but I can't get it, see? I mean, so when you're working on that axis, that's the kind of thing you'll see. Behind every person, you know, think about it this way. People that like to criticize everybody else's ideas and plans, you know. Now, they're not obstructionists, and they don't have any interest in power at all. I'm on your committee. You're the chairman or the chairwoman. And I don't have any power issues, no power shadow in me. I'm just helping you see the flaws in your point of view. See? But of course, in my shadow is the hidden desire to completely control by seeing to it that nothing happens. Our institutions are eaten up with this. Have you ever been on a board or a committee in an institution? They're famous for not getting anything done, and this is what all this king stuff is in the unconscious. Can you imagine working in a mental health institution or a faculty? Because there's so much magician energy in the conscious mind, and all that king stuff is in the shadow, and they don't want to be the dean, they say, and then when they become the dean, well, you know about that story. They don't want him to be able to do anything either when he becomes the dean or she becomes the dean. But anyway, now we need to work on, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, this position demands attention, which is kind of sad. And then,
what is sad? What is sad?
I was going to say I'm one of those idiots too, I'm sure.
We all got these, friends. This is all us.
But is another way of drawing attention to it through illness and sickness? I mean, I see people.
That would be more. Although, let's get onto the lover. Let's get onto the active and passive lover pathology, and let me just say a couple of these. Obviously, see, in my view, addictive issues are always loads of lover energy. You see the dependency. The dependency can be experienced with a substance. Well, why do I have to experience it with a substance? Because my relationships have really punished me when I've tried to be dependent with them. See, there's nothing wrong with being dependent in an appropriate way some of the time, but if you're with abusive people and you try to be dependent, they will hurt you when you're down. See, you start to try to express your dependency and then they abuse you. There are families in which if the little child stubs her toe and goes to the parent, they will be attacked rather than comforted. Did you ever hear those? So, in other words, don't be dependent. Don't come to me with your dependency needs. So this whole business of addictions is, I can get something I can finally depend on. I at least know where the pushers are. Okay. Or ice cream, somebody said. No, I'm not guilty of that. Frozen yogurt. See, I'm responsible, right? No, secretly, it's M&M peanuts. But there's a good book to look at in terms of this relationship between grandiosity and self-soothing about this, trying to deal with this. It's that Levin book called Alcoholism and Other Addictions, a Self-Psychology Approach, which puts it in the context of this attempt to regulate one's grandiosity and trying to deal with the excitation of grandiosity. See, grandiosity, when it's untransformed and related to in a constructive way, always makes you agitated in some way. See? Always an anxious side to it. Okay. Sexual addictions. Dependent personality disorders, and both passive and active. That is, say, what we call the dependent personality is this. Also, the histrionic personality, the active dependent, what they used to call the hysterical personality, is flood of lover energy. Yeah. Oh, people have pointed out the tendency of the histrionic personality to be into clothes, flamboyant behavior. You know, you frequent some of the bars where the Art Institute kids hang out. And what do you see? Well, you see there's some things about this. You think about the positive side of this first. I mean, it's play and it's display and it's an appreciation of things, including clothes, jewels, bodies, see? Trees, ecology. Here's another thing you need if you're going to be into ecology. Who cares about the whales, you know? Well, if you're really into this stuff, you have a sense of connection with all other species. People that talk to plants. Anybody here? A lot of lover energy. If you're into gardening, a lot of lover energy. If you're into dancing, a lot of lover energy. If you're into singing, a lot of lover energy. So there are a lot of good things about it. If you have to be the center of attention all the time, but not in the kind of sitting on the throne way, but in the sort of dancing, being the song and dance person, you know, what's that musical chorus line? You know, that's lover energy. I want to be out there in that chorus line. Or if you've seen that movie, All That Jazz, have you seen that? If you want to understand flooding with lover energy, look at All That Jazz. What was that choreographer's name? That was Bob Fosse. Man, that guy had 100 proof lover energy. Killed him, but it was beautiful while it burned. Bob Fosse. He had a way of, I mean, the male sexuality really comes out. I mean, he had a way of looking at women, which was totally erotic from a, you know, masculine kind of point of view. And those films and those choreographed routines really lay that out clearly. Passivity in the lover, what would that look like? Think about what somebody that is really not able to connect with that would be like. That is, they project it on everybody else. Think about it. Well, part of it. But when I think body, think about how you would experience the body if you were totally denying this. It could be a masochist. Evidence. And the person that just says they don't feel their body. Feel wooden. All that sort of thing. Person that's sort of dysphoric and what's that word they use in sex therapy? Anhedonic.
That's
right.
not like anhedonic. You mean like anhedonic.
Not anhedonic. No, it's anhedonic. That's right. Without pleasure. Without pleasure. And so what do you, if you look at this thing from this point of view, see, it depends, it matters what you think theoretically, see, because if I were working with somebody that told me that they were just wooden, they were just a block of wood, and I had some other theoretical point of view, I would think, well, this person can never be better on this, I would think they don't have any circuits for lover. But if I have this kind of point of view, a Jungian point of view, which assumes that this stuff's in the hardware, and I think, well, we got to help them find the button to turn this thing on. See, and so you have a much more hopeful point of view for somebody that thinks, oh, I can never experience anything like that.
What if you have to find the button to turn it on?
That's very common. See, it would be this southerner that asked me that because she knows that I wanted to talk about the country song that says, whoever turned her on forgot to turn her off. There are a lot of people who are that way, and that is to say they are so overstimulated so much of the time, and they're flooding in this lower energy so much of the time, they have to medicate themselves. I mean, that's where you get into addictions. That's where you get into sedating yourself with, you buy up a whole bunch of Valiums. And if you don't take your Valiums regularly, you just start getting turned on and tuned in too much, see. There are a lot of people like that. Music world is full of them. Entertainment world is full of them. And so, I mean, you could write untold numbers of books on that. There have been books written on that. Postcards from the Edge. Yeah, seen that.
Kind of cocaine addiction in connection with that. It's more stimulants.
Yeah.
You see the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Cocaine addiction, really, you mainline all this great self. That's why cocaine addiction is so scary. Because once you've been God, or the goddess, who wants to be just ordinary again? See, that's why it's so hard to, when you've really experienced this stuff directly through freebasing cocaine or something like that, or crack, it's awfully difficult to. And of course, a lot of our treatment programs don't want the people to get real in touch with a natural high anyway, afraid of that too. So anyway, now let's come full circle. Now we got a few minutes left. You can go on and on and on and play that out. I've done that in my lectures, and that's available, and you'll have a chance to think about that. And we'll be talking about that. We can talk about it more in terms of images of God. But you see, when you're thinking about this as sort of the vengeance of God or the persecution of God, it's interesting to think about how you might think about this sort of thing. That is to say, identifying with some aspect of what I like to call the God self. This structure, I would call it the diamond body or the God self. And the goal is for you to be connected with it and relate to it and energized by it, fueled by it, the self-psychologists say. But you don't want to be fried by it, right? And you don't want to think you are the sole expression of it in the world. And so You might think about psychopathology this way, if you wanted to go back to that divine persecution. You know, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Idolatry is the fundamental source of psychopathology. That is, identifying with a facet of the diamond body, or denying that you have any contact with it, and identifying the God self with you or you, which is also idolatry, rather than relating to it and knowing that it's available. Theologians used to talk about that as grace. Free grace. See? And so, and my argument on this thing is that this thing is within you, and it is loaded with energy. Period. All you need. More than you need. And so a Jungian point of view about individuation and wholeness is not losing touch with this, because if you think you've lost touch with it, you've really got it looking over your shoulder. It hadn't gone away. But not just being in touch with it, trying to fly at the right altitude around it. Not getting too close or too far away. Yeah.
I was just curious, trying to understand the concept that you've laid out.
Mm-hmm.
This is the God self that's not our ego. Our ego is separate from,
that's right,
as you've mentioned. And it's called the God self, but the word...
Well, I'm just calling it that because I think that's a way of thinking about the diamond body, because it is the model for the self. And theologically speaking, that's probably what theologians have meant by the imago Dei. That's all I'm saying. That's not a technical word.
I guess my question would be, we're using words here that are magician lovers. They're human words. They're words.
Yeah, right. This is about our species.
Okay.
I don't know what pigeons would say.
How would the gods or the archetypes or the archetypes, the gods have become symptoms or that movement?
Yeah.
How do they move through this model?
All sorts of ways.
See, well, because it's the way I've seen it is almost like different types of gods, or as we imagine them, move through this and are filtered particularly from each of these different ways.
Yeah, different times too, with different gods. That is, Zeus sometimes manifests in his form as lover, and all he's got his mind on is sex. Sometimes he manifests as the divine warrior. He wants to kill you.
Now,
sometimes he's the king.
Now, why remove the Zeus-ness from its context in the way he is, as mythology presents it, and then present him that Zeus acts through these particular ways instead of remaining in the image itself?
Oh, I don't recommend that you not learn the mythology of Zeus.
Certainly not, I know that.
I'm just, and that you look at the way in which different figures relate to each other in mythology, because that undoubtedly talks about trends that people have observed throughout history and personality pattern. In fact, I think we need to do a lot more with that. We need to do it, not just the Greeks, we need to go back and study the Mahabharata, and we need to go back and study the Vedas and so forth and get some sense about those patterns there too. That's important work. That's what Bolin has done. But I'm just suggesting that that the word Zeus doesn't help you too much. You have to understand what the different forms of manifestation are and what the particular strengths and weaknesses are in each of those, or it doesn't help you work with psychopathology. Because, you know, I can say, well, I guess this guy's got a Zeus problem. Which one?
Wouldn't it be the same way he's got a king problem?
Oh, no. King problems are very specific, very delimited. They're not all over the place.
Well, I find, I guess, from my own background, I find that a Zeus image is very specific. It's not in the realm of possibilities. It's imagined precisely.
It's a narrative, right? But it has many different expressions and many different patterns within the narrative.
Right.
So if I'm working with your personality or with his personality, and you're presenting as a schizoid personality, if there's a place in the narrative where Zeus goes off by himself and nurses, it doesn't really help too much just say, well, this is a Zeus problem. This is an expression of Zeus. I mean, one has to say, in what locale? What pattern is this? And I mean, I think it's important to do the comparative mythological narratives. I do a lot of work with that. But when I'm thinking about biograms, I don't think there's a Zeus biogram. See, I think there is a king biogram. And other psychoanalysts that are not Jungian have talked about things just in different language. That I'm really talking about a behavioral potential that's pretty tightly integrated. So I don't see them as conflicting. I think that it's very important to study mythological systems to see what configurations, for example, the mythological stories of Mars having an affair with Aphrodite. Now that's very important, and it tells you about a recurrent pattern between males and females. But it does not help you understand the underlying structures which tend to lead females to take a lover position with aggressive males. See? Doesn't explain that as a model. It reports that that's a pattern that you see often, but it does not help you explain it structurally. And so, while you need to understand that story and what it reflects in human interactions, there's another level of analysis, and I don't see them as mutually exclusive at all. Other comments about, do you see how people may have interpreted? Now, you can get into the question, and maybe later we can. Is God doing this to people or not? That's a theological question. And the Jungians have to decide where they come down. Different Jungians, some Jungians equate the self and God. I don't. I think that the archetypal self for our species is probably an image of the balance of energies that one could argue exist in a divine reality. But I also think you can argue that God, the existence of God, could be seen as separate from the archetypal self, which I see as a psychological structure. Maybe the signature of God, maybe the stamp of God, maybe the seal of God, maybe the formula of God's balance. But you could argue that God is more like Whitehead says God is. Yeah. He said different things at different times, you know. But you know, in answer to Job, there's a tendency to sort of think that the self and God are very much related. Yeah.
If the self is God, then if all humankind were annihilated, God would die. There would be no God.
Well, you might argue that. Yeah.
I mean, that'd be the natural.
Yeah. Yeah. But, you know, there are different ways of cutting that. The only thing is you want to figure out how you would argue it and what you feel comfortable with. I think it's possible to say that your archetypal self may be your enemy sometimes. Jung thought it was. Now, does that mean God is your enemy? Some people can argue that God is the enemy, and they have. I don't think God is the enemy, personally, but that's just my opinion. When we talk about the archetypal self, I think it's quite clear. It is a reality, and you must relate to it carefully. Jung would say that. I would agree with it. You don't just think. And here's another thing that we got to stop now, but there are Jungians that tend to be a little romantic about this archetypal self thing. That is to say, the self will save you. You know, the self is going to bring you to individuation. Well, if that's true, why is the world such a cesspool? Because if all of us got it, it ought to have brought us to individuation. It sure hadn't done it. And I think at the same time, though, you can say that the self does have an internal regulation. That is, if you're too much in here, there's going to be unconscious processes set off that are going to, what's that word? Enantiodromia. It's going to come and get you from this side. If you're too much here, there's going to be some constellation of this energy. But there's no guarantee that it won't be constellated in a way that won't destroy you. Thought of that? Okay, you've been great today, and I'll look forward to seeing some of you Friday. You will enjoy the other instructor for that day, Julia Jewett, one of our new analysts that we're very proud of. And so we'll have a chance to talk again, and then I'll be talking with you more about this creation stuff and selfhood on Monday. So thank you very much. You've been great.
This concludes Robert Moore's seminar, The Darkness of Divine Persecution, Individuation and Psychopathology, presented by the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago on July 16, 1991. If you are interested in additional information on Robert Moore, the Institute for Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Spirituality, or other audio programs by Robert Moore, please visit www.robertmoore-phd.com.